Soya Group was ranked 6th among the largest Korean conglomerates. It was a huge corporation covering a wide range of businesses including hotels, retail, and the chemical industry. This building housed people responsible for human resources, finance, and strategic planning. The corporation's headquarters housed the health department on the 14th floor. Work was in full swing. The office was constantly noisy with the sound of phone calls and employee conversations. The box that this young man was carrying obscured his vision in front of him, and he literally moved around the office blind. The young man tried very hard not to get caught anywhere or lose track of this whole pile of documents and felt very tense. The young man was supposed to get into the department that dealt with the rules and approaches to running a business that would contribute to its sustainable development. This department was called ESG. A young man with a box approached Mr. Lee, who was sitting and working at his computer, and the older man said good morning to him. The worker smiled and noted that he wanted to leave a few samples for their team, to which Mr. Lee asked him to leave these samples somewhere in the corner. Mr. Lee also asked the employee to watch his feet, and at that moment a crash and a scream from the young man were heard. The guy dropped a box on the floor and fell down himself. The reason for this awkward fall was another box that someone had placed right at his feet, causing the young man to start cursing, noting that they could have at least leaned it against the wall. A girl passing by noted that the young man was absolutely right because a pile of things had accumulated that needed to be sorted, and then she also greeted Mr. Lee. The girl sat down at one of the tables and asked the gentleman if he minded her working a little with the numbering. He asked her to clean up and put everything back in its place as soon as he finished his work. Many employees passing by constantly greeted Mr. Lee. On the one hand, he was pleased, but on the other, he was constantly distracted from his own work. Soon one of the employees approached him and introduced their newcomer named Choi Jae-woo, who was supposed to work in the 3rd strategic team. Mr. Lee looked at the newcomer, who looked very nervous, and after greeting him noted that he was glad to meet him. Mr. Lee turned around and gave his full name, which was Lee Min-soo, and explained that he was the team lead of the ESG department, meaning the person who provided direction, and leadership to the group. The employee who brought the newcomer noted that he would be visiting them often, and that he needed to be taken care of and brought up to speed. Then he suggested that the newcomer take apart the board that was lying under his feet. When the guys took up the board, the girl who was sitting at the next table greeted Manager Yoon, who was concerned about the newcomer's success. The girl's name was Min Jong, and when asked how she was doing, she said that she had been completely overwhelmed with her internship and midterm assessments of interns lately. At that time, the employee who was constantly running around with boxes couldn't get through because the guys were holding a board right in the passage and asked the newbie to let him squeeze through. The newcomer found it very strange that there were so many people in the ESG department who constantly needed something, which created a huge crush. Soon everyone passed each other. The employee lugging around the things was also in a hurry to leave this department where the devil could break his leg. Newcomer Choi Jae-woo asked Manager Yoon why so many people were leaving their things in the ESG office, even people from the HR department. The manager explained this by saying that in this department there were empty shelves where you could store anything, but in other departments there was not enough space. The shelves were empty because there were very few employees in the ESG department. To be more precise, team leader Lee Min-soo was the only employee there. It was a great surprise to Jae-woo that the team consisted of only one employee, and Manager Yoon explained again that he had sent the team members to other departments saying that they could handle this work alone. Jae-woo was surprised that such a large amount of work could be handled by one person, and Manager Yoon noted that Mr. Lee was doing a good job. The newcomer was even more surprised, thinking that this Mr. Lee was highly respected among all the other employees, since he could handle such a volume of work on his own. On average, one headquarters oversaw 22 branches. Naturally, the importance of each branch in a large conglomerate was unquestioned. Even with experienced and highly qualified personnel, the intensity of work always remained high. But at this headquarters, there was a one-man team, and it was always something shocking to everyone who heard about it. Mr. Lee answered the phone and told his interlocutor that he had just uploaded their strategy on the issue of animal rights. The topic was poultry farming, specifically laying hens. Min-soo explained that he had written a replacement for the old text which had less emphasis on animal cruelty and believed that such censorship would be appreciated. Following the conversation, Min-soo asked his interlocutor to check the contracts for the submission of files from CCTV cameras and certification marks, and also to remember to include certification marks on the packaging. In parallel with this conversation, Min-soo opened a document containing information about a chemical fertilizer plant. After finishing the conversation, team leader Lee Min-soo hung up and exhaled heavily, when he immediately heard another ring. The team leader looked carefully at the ringing phone. He had no idea who could have called him. Min-soo picked up the phone, and after stating his name and the department of the company, he realized that the caller was Managing Director Na Hyung-soo from the chemical industry. The director called about an environmental issue and asked if Min-soo knew what they had planned for the next day. The team leader noted that it most likely concerned the construction of a fourth soybean fertilizer plant. The director confirmed this and said that representatives of the environmental group were supposed to arrive along with officials from the ministry, and those idiots would probably have dragged a bunch of reporters along with them. The managing director grabbed his head, saying that these people were very annoying and could cause a lot of problems. The managing director asked Min-soo to prepare everything necessary on time, so that they would be as prepared as possible. By that time, Lee Min-soo had already become familiar with the materials and had roughly drawn up an outline of the text. However, there was a nuance that the managing director should have been aware of. Min-soo apologized and noted that he would not be able to handle all the necessary materials on time, and the director was infuriated that he once again refused to work overtime. Min-soo, without the slightest worry, asked the director what time the meeting was scheduled. When she heard the time, she promised to send the files half an hour before it. The director looked at his watch, and seeing that it was already 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he was surprised that Min-soo would only need 1 hour of the next working day to complete all the work. The director shouted that Min-soo could simply leave an hour later than usual and send the file, but the team leader noted that unfortunately this was impossible since working on the document would require 7 to 8 hours. The young man explained that he would continue working from home to finish everything on time and would definitely send everything ready by 1000 a.m., but this did not reassure the director, and he was afraid that they would screw up and the construction would be postponed. But since there was no other choice, the managing director noted that Min-soo could be trusted, and he assured that he always keeps his promises regarding the work completed on time, so there was no need to worry. The work hours passed slowly, and Min-soo did not get distracted from his tasks, knowing that there was still much to do. As the workday drew to a close, Min-soo began to complete his current tasks and prepare to leave the office. Min-soo emerged from the sidelines as if he were in no hurry. He leisurely tapped his fingers on the keyboard, typing a document. Having finished typing the document, Min-soo glanced at her wristwatch and, seeing the time, closed all programs on the computer. A few minutes later, one of the employees approached him and stopped near his workplace. Jae-woo apologized for disturbing him before handing the document to the team leader, but when he looked at Min-soo's workstation, he was taken aback. The team leader's chair was already empty, even though only a few minutes had passed since the official end of the workday. Jae-woo looked at Mr. Lee's desk with great surprise. There were a lot of notebooks, folders with documents and magazines lying on the table, as if Min-soo had simply stepped away for a few minutes. Jae-woo knew that ESG always had a lot of work to do and couldn't understand how Min-soo managed to do everything on his own. Hoping that Min-soo wouldn't be offended by him, Jae-woo decided to look into one of the document folders that was lying on the table. Jae-woo quickly scanned the first page and the lovely ones beyond. Jae-woo became very interested and looked through the entire folder, turning page after page. Jae-woo couldn't find a single mistake. Min-soo's entire work was perfect. For a moment, Jae-woo doubted that Min-soo had really done all the work alone, as such a result seemed impossible. What was even more surprising to Jae-woo was that despite doing his job perfectly, Min-soo managed to leave the office on time and was never late for even a minute. While Jae-woo was surprised by his colleague, Min-soo had already managed to reach his apartment building. Min-soo was still in no hurry and walked leisurely up the stairs to his apartment. Opening the penultimate doors, Min-soo breathed a sigh of relief that he was finally home. Already standing in front of the door of his apartment, Min-soo became cheerful, and a faint smile played on his face. The first thing Min-soo did was put his things away and change into his home clothes, hanging his work clothes away. After changing his clothes, Min-soo began preparing dinner and got out the necessary ingredients. The team leader's always serious face in the office was replaced by a smile, and his mood became upbeat. Before starting to cook, Min-soo thought that the charcoal briquette needed 30 minutes to heat up properly, and if he hurried, he would have time to cook everything in time. First, he decided to prepare the pork backbone and lightly pounded the meat with a large kitchen mallet. Min-soo knew full well that chopping and crushing the pork backbone changed its texture. The meat should have been placed in a container with ground red pepper, ginger, whole garlic, and a small amount of soy sauce. Next it was worth adding chopped green and onion, then sugar and red pepper paste. Finally, it was necessary to add mirin, mix everything and put it on the fire. Soon Min-soo was enjoying the magnificent sight and smell of pork backbone cooked over charcoal. Min-soo believed that meat that was directly in contact with the fire was always the most delicious, and among all the options charcoal fire was the best choice. Min-soo could hardly wait until it was time to start his dinner. The recipe called for taking a well-roasted pork backbone and wrapping it in perilla leaves, dipping the peppers in samjang and enjoying. Min-soo was more than pleased with what he had come up with. Deciding to spice up his dinner, Min-soo poured himself some soju, which in his opinion was never a bad thing. The evening seemed perfect to him. The weather was fine, there was a delicious dinner and drinks, and the work was finished. As Min-soo was wrapping the meat in a perilla leaf, he heard a female voice with a hint of indignation directed at him. A girl came out to him and was indignant at how he could eat all alone. Min-soo noted that she had smelled his food and demonstratively rolled his eyes, at which the girl only laughed and walked towards him. The girl's name was Hannah and she lived downstairs. 4 years ago, when Min-soo first moved into this building, she was a spunky 17-year-old. He didn't even notice how quickly she grew up, and they became very close, practically friends. Hannah, seeing the dinner Min-soo had prepared, immediately ran for a bag of rice, and he said after her that she felt right at home. Hannah returned with her rice and began to devour what Min-soo had prepared, noting that they should eat together more often. Min-soo looked at the girl and asked if she had ever been in a relationship since she had so much time, but instead of answering the question, she asked a counter-question asking why the neighbor hadn't gotten married. Min-soo calmly replied that the time had not yet come for that, and Hannah said that the same applied to her. During dinner, Hannah turned to Min-soo again. She suggested that they could run for a beer to refresh their palate, and Min-soo paused for a second, lost in thought. He asked if she could get some dried pollock, and Hannah with a wide smile assured him that she would bring it right away. They spent their time together until it got dark outside. They sat on the terrace under the starry sky and drank beer. Hannah looked at her neighbor and asked if he could sing a song since so much time had passed, but he sharply replied that he would not. Hannah began to beg him and even tried to bribe him, promising that if he sang, she would do the cleaning instead of him. Min-soo finally decided to agree and asked the girl to bring him a guitar, although he still didn't really want to do it. Hannah immediately ran and brought him a guitar. Min-soo tuned it and began to play a melody. Min-soo played very well, and Hannah liked listening to his songs and often asked him to play. Hannah felt very happy at that moment. She was delighted that her neighbor had finally given in to her requests. Min-soo gave himself completely to the music and in that moment forgot how much he didn't want to play. He looked out at the city at night. The city lights flickered, accompanied by his music. After playing the guitar, Min-soo went home and soon fell asleep, sleeping until the morning. The morning was very calm and sunny. Birds sang their songs under the windows of residential buildings. After waking up, Min-soo went to the office and started work no earlier than the appointed time. He had to call the managing director first thing in the morning. He told him he'd already sent the file he needed and asked him to check his email. After reporting on the work done, Min-soo hung up the phone, but immediately another call rang. With a sigh, Min-soo picked up the phone again and introduced himself to the other person. Min-soo was very surprised when he heard that the HR director had called him. The director asked Min-soo to come see him, and he immediately rushed to fulfill the request. When Min-soo entered the office, the director was very thoughtfully studying some papers. Min-soo opened the door, noted that they wanted to see him, and entered the office. The director, looking from the papers to her employee, noted that he could pass. The director asked how his work was going and whether it was too difficult to do everything, to which Min-soo assured that he was coping quite well. Min-soo immediately clarified whether he was called only for this matter, and the director, calling him by his position and last name, frowned. An employee of ours told the director that it was worth appointing people under his leadership. Min-soo was indignant about why they suddenly made such a decision and noted that he did not request additional personnel. The director emphasized that the decision had already been made. Min-soo was again indignant and noted that he should have first asked what he thought about this issue, but the director interrupted him and said that they were talking about one person. Looking at Min-soo, the director replied that this was especially very special, which surprised the guy. Min-soo couldn't even guess who the director was talking about. The director quickly explained that he was talking about the chairman's only daughter. Min-soo noted that according to his information, the girl had studied in the States, and the director responded that this meant she had apparently already completed her studies, since she had been nominated for the position. Min-soo continued to be indignant, asking why it was decided to assign her to him, and the director, realizing how dissatisfied his employee was, who was always concerned about his privacy, covered his face with his hand and assured that he knew nothing and that it was a decision from above. Spinning around in his chair, the director noted that in any case this girl was unlikely to stay for long, and then asked Min-soo to simply keep an eye on her while she worked at their company. He looked closely at the guy and emphasized that mistakes were unacceptable in this case. The director asked if Min-soo understood that if he made a mistake several heads would roll at once, and Min-soo did not argue he understood everything perfectly. The director also noted that since it would be awkward to leave only the two of them on the team, he would add another manager and one assistant, and asked Min-soo to just endure these inconveniences for a while. After listening to the director, Min-soo immediately hurried to leave his office and return to his workplace. The director, studying the reports on the new employees, was outraged because the manager had frankly lousy results. The assistant had been stuck in this position for several years, and ideally such people should have been pressured into simply quitting. But it was clear that they were not simply assigned to the same team as the chairman's daughter. The situation likely meant that the people behind this decision hoped to destroy the young girl's career, and Min-soo understood this. Min-soo thought about this situation for a long time and didn't even notice how one of the employees greeted him. It was the new manager who brought another box. Min-soo asked the newcomer to collect all of his department's belongings by the end of the current day. After thinking for a moment, Min-soo immediately changed his mind and asked to collect the things by the end of the next day and pass the same information on to other departments. The newcomer, hearing this, thought that everyone was guilty of something. Min-soo calmed him down, assuring him that no one was at fault and that the things simply needed to be taken away and the tables cleared. Min-soo explained that new employees had been assigned to him, so he needed some free time. Even the newbie was very surprised that new employees would be in the department where Min-soo worked, but he was not going to say anything more and once again asked to put away all the things. The newbie nodded his head, promised to pass it on to the others, and seeing that the team leader was getting up from the table, he asked where he was going. Min-soo briefly replied that it was already 6:00 p.m., which meant the end of the working day. Min-soo threw the bag over his shoulder, noted that it was already time for him to go home, and immediately hurried to the exit. Soon another employee entered the ESG department and greeted the team leader, wishing him good morning. Min-soo looked out from behind his computer monitor and grimaced slightly, hoping his expression wasn't too noticeable. Min-jong asked if Mr. Lee had read the document she had sent him, and then introduced the new employees of the department. Min-young pointed to a young man who was very serious and said that he was the new department manager named Young Kyung-jun. The girl then introduced a rather shy young man who now held the position of assistant and whose name was Park Ji-hoon. Lastly, Min-soo introduced the girl who had brought about these changes. She was the chairman's daughter, and her name was Kang Chae-eun. Lee Min-soo looked around at the new employees in his department without much friendliness. Having moved back a little in his chair, Min-soo immediately suggested that the newcomers should do their formal introductions later, explaining that he should finish his work first. The newcomers were shown their workstations, and it seemed as if it was their first time in an office, as they were surprised by even the most seemingly ordinary things. But despite their surprise and awkwardness, the newcomers tried to organize their workstations and get used to the environment a little before starting to perform work tasks. Kang Chae-eun walked up to her workstation, which was no different from any other. The girl thought to herself that now it became clear to her what ESG was, and that it was not a new place of exile. Kang Chae-eun was told that it was a phantom and deserted department, but in reality everything turned out to be even worse than she imagined. It was then that Kang Chae-eun generally understood why they hadn't sent her to such a place. While she was studying abroad, news reached her that her father had fallen into a coma. The girl immediately lost her temper, and upon arriving in her home country, went to the hospital to see her father. Chae-eun sat near her father's hospital bed, holding his hand and crying, not understanding why everything turned out this way. At that moment, a man entered the room, and after noting with a smile how long they hadn't seen each other, immediately bombarded the girl with questions about her studies and why she had returned so early. The man who entered the room was Kang Chae-eun's uncle, but the girl was not particularly happy to see him. Kang Chae-eun always knew that nothing good could be expected from this man. The girl felt as if her uncle and his people had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Kang Chae-eun's uncle's family quickly took a leading position in the conglomerate. As soon as Kang Chae-eun's father retired due to illness, global changes quickly began to occur in the company. Kang Chae-eun knew she had to reclaim the influence that only her family had sought. She had to protect herself and her loved ones, so she had to go to great lengths. Her job in this department was precisely for this reason, but from the very first minutes of her first working day, the girl was dissatisfied. Chae-yoon didn't understand what was going on in the department because for a very long time she had been sitting with other new colleagues and not doing anything in particular, and there were no work-related orders. At this time, Min-soo was trying to finish his tasks so that he could be completely free to communicate with the newcomers and that special girl. Soon his voice was heard. The team leader asked if everyone had reviewed their department's work materials. The newcomers were secretly relieved to finally be noticed and replied that they had read them thoroughly. But only one of them, Park Ji-hoon, was too biased towards the new team leader and didn't even try to hide it. Min-soo noted that in this case he would not explain to anyone what the job entailed, but he emphasized that he had to talk about his internal policies in the department. Min-soo explained that efficiency and responsibility are paramount to him. Furthermore, employees must continually improve their skills and competence, and in the future they will need to establish teamwork so that the entire department can work harmoniously and smoothly. Kang Chae-yoon listened more attentively than anyone else and tried to understand what kind of person the team leader with whom she would have to work directly was. Min-soo continued by asking the newcomers to imagine a situation where they were faced with an important task and the obvious solution for the team was to work overtime to complete the task on time, and then asked what they would do. There was silence in the department and everyone wondered what the catch was in this question. Min-soo was in no hurry and waited patiently for an answer. I really hoped that they would answer correctly, although he was already preparing to explain the nuance about overtime. Realizing there would be no response, the team lead approached the manager, who was not pleased, and asked if he would answer the question. The manager replied that if the task was truly important, there was no choice but to work overtime. Min-soo also asked Park Ji-hoon's assistant, and then he responded with great excitement that he thought the same as manager Ken-jun. Min-soo silently turned his gaze to Kang Chae-yoon, who sighed heavily before answering and said that the answer was obvious and completing the task was the highest priority. Min-soo did not look up from his papers, but Valia chuckled and emphasized that the thinking of each of them was fundamentally incorrect. Chae-yoon was very surprised to hear this and looked questioningly at her team leader. Min-soo explained that the very fact that they had to work overtime already spoke of their inefficiency, and thus they were demonstrating their incompetence. Chae-yoon jumped up in his chair at this answer and was indignant, noting that there had been situations when urgent work had arisen. Min-soo, without changing his expression, replied that in that case, he shouldn't have taken her on at all, and this answer shocked the girl even more. Min-soo glanced at everyone present and asked if they had heard the expression that the worst money drove out the best. The team leader explained that if someone suddenly transferred urgent time-sensitive work to their department, it meant that their side itself had failed to complete the assigned task on time. Min-soo also explained that this was only half the problem and that over time their incompetence and unwillingness to evaluate would begin to increasingly parasitize on their team. Min-soo glanced at everyone again and asked if this could be called anything other than parasitism. Min-soo said that such influxes of bad money were prone to collapse uncontrollably, so they were all obliged to stand by their principles under any circumstances. The assistant asked if this meant that if the task required overtime they all had to abandon it immediately. Min-soo replied that everything was correct. Jong Kyung-jun looked at the team leader through his fingers, smiling as if he'd been told nonsense. Min-soo stood up from his desk and said that if there were no more questions for him, then they could finish, and immediately headed for the exit, which surprised his new colleagues. Kang Chae-yoon timidly turned to Min-soo, who had not yet come out, and pointed out that they had not done any work all day. Min-soo looked at the girl quite seriously and was a little upset because he thought he had been understood very clearly. Min-soo nodded towards the clock and noted that since it was already 6:00 p.m., it was time to go home. Kang Chae-yoon's mouth dropped open in surprise, not fully understanding whether this was a joke or whether the team leader was being serious. The next day arrived. As always, the company's headquarters was bustling with activity from early morning. Everyone was rushing to get to work on time. Kang Chae-yoon walked into the office leisurely and greeted her colleagues already seated at their desks with a broad smile. Assistant Park Ji-hoon timidly greeted the girl, and manager Young Kyung-jun only glanced in her direction with displeasure. Chae-yoon didn't see the team leader at her desk and asked her colleagues if he had arrived yet. Assistant Ji-hoon responded that it looked like that, nodding towards their team leader's empty seat, which surprised the girl because in her opinion Min-soo was the type of person who came to work early. Chae-yoon sat down at her seat and thought about how she was in a very difficult situation, and given the team lead's internal politics, it was unlikely she would be able to quickly improve her performance. The team's situation and conditions were much worse than expected. Moreover, the team leader made an extremely alarming first impression on Kang Chae-yoon. It was strange for her to hear that the team leader demanded that she give up any overtime on the very first day. The girl leaned back in her chair and clutched her head, thinking that, on the other hand, arguing about the team leader was also difficult. She didn't understand at all how she was supposed to improve her qualifications in such a team. Her thoughts were interrupted by the greeting of Min-soo, who entered the office and said good morning to everyone. The assistant and even the manager responded and reciprocated, but Chae-yoon remained silent. Min-soo glanced at everyone and stopped at Kang Chae-yoon, feeling something strange. Well, he asked her directly if she wanted to tell him something, but the girl replied that she had no questions or statements. Chae-yoon noticed the clock and was very surprised at what a coincidence it was that Min-soo showed up at exactly 900. As if he was checking his watch every minute. Min-soo turned on his computer and after checking the tasks said out loud that they had 5 requests for the department. He looked back at his team and explained that he had already worked on 3 of the 5 requests. Min-soo asked the team to close the remaining 2 requests and noted that one of them was about the safety of soy chemical employees. Min-soo approached the manager and asked him to personally handle this request, but then he became indignant that he was being assigned this task alone. Min-soo asked if he had any problems working alone, and the manager stood up and noted that this case had just arrived yesterday, and that it was his first experience working with such tasks. Min-soo looked questioningly at the manager and asked what he meant by that, and what he replied was that it was too much to let a newbie deal with a task unfamiliar to him alone. Min-soo, without looking up from his papers, replied that the manager had arranged it simply as a trial since he had 11 years of experience in related fields. The manager confirmed his experience but added that his previous responsibilities were very different, to which Min-soo replied that if he had any difficulties he could always look through the department's old documents. Min-soo looked up and looked at the manager to ask if it was difficult for him. The manager pursed his lips and said nothing, realizing that the team leader would continue to stand his ground. The manager agreed to try, and the assistant breathed a sigh of relief while Min-soo asked the manager to expect a report in 2 days and by that time to send him the documents for approval by 3 o'clock from tomorrow. Min-soo finished his conversation with the manager and moved on to the assistant, who jumped up on the spot upon hearing his name, worried that he would be given a very difficult task. Min-soo asked him to review the Soya Hotel application and prepare a presentation by 5 o'clock, handing it in directly to him. The assistant was very surprised that the task was supposed to be completed today. Min-soo emphasized that this was a very simple task, and given his 3 years of experience, she shouldn't have caused any difficulties. The assistant agreed and didn't argue further. Meanwhile, Kang Chae-yoon simply observed everyone and waited her turn. Min-soo immediately went to the girl and explained that the box with documents contained a teamwork manual and that she was supposed to familiarize herself with it, to which she immediately agreed. Min-soo looked at something on his computer and asked the girl if 10 days would be enough. Kang Chae-yoon replied that this time would be enough for her, and Min-soo stated that these were all the instructions for now. Looking at the newcomers again, Min-soo said that they should try and demonstrate as effective work as possible. Min-soo emphasized that this had to be done so he could leave work on time and not be late. These words made the manager grind his teeth even more. Min-soo didn't make any more statements, and everyone immersed themselves in their work. As Kang Chae-yoon began her task, she thought that she had to come to terms with the truth that she wouldn't be able to improve her results quickly. In this case, the girl had no choice but to work with what she had. Soon evening came, but the entire office continued to work hard on their tasks. Min-soo worked on his computer all day, taking almost no breaks. At some point, Min-soo looked at his wristwatch and checked the time. The team leader turned to Assistant Pak and asked if his presentation was ready. The team leader asked him with cold persistence whether he hadn't had enough time for the task, and he turned pale and trembled, starting to make excuses, stumbling over the first few words. Kang Chae-yoon looked at her assistant and noted that he didn't even have time for lunch, and it was clear from his face that the work had not been completed on time. Min-soo asked Assistant Park even more insistently whether he had completed the work or not. He replied that he had, but there was one nuance. Min-soo said that in that case the assistant got a job loading it, and then with even greater excitement replied that the work was ready. But even he saw that it had many flaws. Min-soo glanced slightly at his assistant and in a sharp, cold tone repeated that he should upload the work to the computer. Assistant Pak, trying to cope with his own strong excitement, asked the subject for 1 second and began to try to load the work. A few minutes later, the assistant announced that he had uploaded the work to the shared drive, and Min-soo immediately opened the file. Assistant Pak couldn't contain his opinion and even stood up from his seat, already preparing some kind of justification. But instead of the expected criticism, the assistant heard that his work was good and was very surprised. He asked the team leader if this was true, and he emphasized that the assistant had been working hard and should go get a cup of coffee and take a walk and then review materials from the team's previous tasks. Assistant Park asked again if he had done a good job, and Min-soo, dissatisfied, emphasized that he had already said that the work was good and asked why the assistant sounded so disappointed. Assistant Park immediately rose from his seat, announced he had no more questions, and went to get himself some coffee. Chae-yoon turned and looked at him surprised. She too had expected him to be scolded, but he'd done so well that he deserved praise. Soon-young, Kyung-jun's manager, also announced that he had uploaded his file to the shared drive, and Chae-yoon became a little worried. Min-soo was surprised that the manager had managed to cope, and then replied that the team leader had already had a similar task in old documents, and he took the ready-made references and was able to cope quickly. Min-soo smiled faintly and chuckled, asking for a minute to check this work. Min-soo looked at the manager and said that, as expected, his 11 years of experience spoke for themselves, and as he said, there should not be any problems, which is what happened. The manager smiled slightly and asked if he had done well too, and Min-soo confirmed that everything was excellent. The manager asked him to go for a well-deserved smoke break and noted that he should then sit down and look through the materials, and Min-soo, don't be afraid, didn't object to this. Chae-yoon felt very awkward and couldn't understand what was going on. Kang Chae-yoon grew up in a chaebol family. She discovered she had a natural knack for accurately assessing people and situations. She admitted that she only had 1 day to analyze, and she quickly concluded that Assistant Pak was not competent, but he deserved praise. Manager Jung, who seemed so indifferent to Chae-yoon, completed the task a day before the deadline. The girl was worried that from the moment she arrived in this place, not a single conclusion she made turned out to be correct. She sighed heavily and looked at Min-soo, who continued to work. This man seemed the least understandable to her. His words on the first day, his behavior, and his adherence to precise deadlines were very strange. She came to this company with a clear goal in mind, but now she had no idea what was going on around her. The only thing she could be sure of was that their topic leader would leave work at exactly 6:00 p.m. During the last minutes of her workday, Kang Chae-yoon kept her eyes glued to the wall clock. There were only a few minutes left until the end of the working day, but the team leader continued to work. For a moment the girl even doubted this guess, but as soon as the clock showed 1,800 minutes, Soo got up from the table. Min-soo looked at each employee and declared that that was all for the day. Min-soo headed towards the exit and thanked everyone for their hard work before opening the doors. All 3 employees silently glanced at their team lead. None of them could yet fully understand this man. Manager Chan laughed as soon as team leader walked out the door. The manager noted with delight how their team leader was leaving work and turned to Assistant Pak. The manager asked the assistant if he was interested in what their topic leader did in his free time, but the assistant replied that he was more concerned about whether their team leader seemed strange. Manager Chan asked Assistant Park with one eyebrow every day what exactly he meant. The assistant glanced at his watch and emphasized that their team leader had left the office exactly to the second, and that his foot had stepped over the threshold at exactly 6:00 p.m. The manager chuckled in surprise and asked if this had happened exactly to the second, and the assistant assured that he had clearly seen it and turned to Miss Chae-yoon to confirm. Chae-yoon said thoughtfully that the same thing happened in the morning when their team leader just arrived and entered the office at exactly 900 as if on cue. The girl suggested that their topic leader might have some kind of obsessive-compulsive disorder, which is why he was acting so strange. The manager stood up from his workplace and said that in any case it was time for them to wrap up since they had already been sitting in this place for an extra minute and 21 seconds. Assistant Pak immediately agreed with this and began to get ready. The guys at the door turned around and saw that their colleague had remained at her workplace. They asked why she hadn't gone, to which she wished them a good evening and, thanking them for their work, explained that there was still some left. The assistant managers didn't ask why the girl wanted to stay and immediately headed for the exit. Chae-yoon said goodbye to her colleagues, sat back in her chair, and breathed a sigh of relief. Chae-yoon still had a lot of things to sort out, so she decided to stay after everyone else had already left the office. Chae-eun doubted that Assistant Park had really done a good job in such a short time. It was strange that someone like Assistant Park could receive praise from Min-soo. Chae-eun understood that, with such praise, the assistant was a bit of a slouch, but something bothered her. Since the task had already been submitted, she could view it in the shared document, which is what she did. Having opened the shared drive on the video of the mouse cursor on the folder with the assistant's work, she stopped to doubt whether she should look at this work. She felt her heart pounding so wildly that it surprised her she hadn't done anything wrong in general. I got together with my girlfriend, opened Pak's assistant's file, and was very surprised to see his work. Chae-eun was shocked and could not immediately believe that what she saw in the video was actually true. For a while, Chae-eun stared intently at the computer screen, studying the work of Assistant Park. She could not understand why the first impression of this man was deceptive, and in fact he was a good specialist. In her opinion, even a less experienced person would say that Assistant Paki did a quality job, but she didn't understand how he managed it. The girl assumed that this most likely happened because of her uncle, and she was taking everything too seriously, although this could only be for the best. In situations where she needed to regain her position to secure a qualified team, this was a great success, but she had to work very hard to catch up with everyone. She spent a lot of time at the computer and stayed in the office until very late. She was so tired that she fell asleep right at her desk and slept until her phone rang. Chae-eun opened her eyes slightly and realized that it was already very late. The man stood in the main hall and kept glancing nervously at his watch, as if he had been waiting for someone for a very long time. It was Uncle Chae-eun. He was the one who called her and woke her up. The man even managed to get a little worried, wondering if something had happened. Soon Chae-eun herself entered the hall. She looked very sleepy. She apologized and explained that she had accidentally dozed off shortly after calling him. Her uncle assured her everything was fine and asked if she had been given a difficult task. The uncle assumed that the girl probably hadn't eaten anything and suggested going to a good restaurant that was nearby, but the girl didn't agree, noting that she would eat something light since after a heavy meal she immediately felt sleepy. Chae-eun deeply distrusted this man and was unwilling to agree to any of his proposals, even those that seemed like ordinary concern. She noted that he too needed to rest, just like her, implying that they needed to separate. The man did not agree with her and wanted to insist on his proposal. Chae-eun smiled, assured him that everything was fine with her, waved her hand, and hurried away, also promising goodbye that next time she would treat him to something at the restaurant. After this meeting, the girl walked past the gym where she usually worked out after work. She went straight to the locker room to grab her things and go to the shower. The hot water brought her back to normal a little and smoothed out her severe fatigue. After a hard day at work full of stress and nerves, this was just what was needed. The next day began just like any other. The company's headquarters were crowded as usual. The employees were slowly arriving at the start of work hours and were already looking very confused and fussy. Assistant Park and Manager Jong met in the corridor leading to the ESG department. When the men entered their office, they saw that their colleague Chae-eun was already at her workplace, which surprised them greatly as it was still quite early. The manager asked the girl directly why she arrived at the office so early, but Chae-eun noted that he himself had arrived early, but he explained this by saying that they left work early and he had managed to get a good night's sleep. Before sitting down at his desk, Manager Chan looked at the wall clock. There were still 20 minutes left before the start of the working day. Assistant Park and Chae-eun followed suit, checking their watches. All three were silent, but they knew their team leader would appear as usual right at the start of the workday. And so it happened. As soon as the clock struck 9 a.m., the doors to the department opened and Min-soo walked in. He walked towards his workplace without even looking at anyone, but at the same time wished everyone present good morning. Taking off his jacket, he noticed that all the employees were looking at him strangely and asked what the matter was and if anything had happened. Assistant Park shouted that everything was fine, and Min-soo chuckled, thoughtfully sat down at his desk and turned on the computer. He noted that there were practically no new requests and everyone could continue with what they had been doing the day before. Manager Chun immediately stood up from the table and took a pack of cigarettes, noting that in that case you would go for a smoke break. Min-soo, shuffling papers on his desk, didn't mind the break at the very beginning of the workday. At that very moment, the assistant screamed loudly, as if he'd seen something unexpected. Min-soo, hearing the scream, very slowly turned his gaze to him. The manager was outraged that Assistant Pak screamed so loudly and suddenly that it startled him, and asked what was wrong. Assistant Pak, looking confused at his computer screen, said he hadn't seen his work. He was asked what exactly he was talking about, and the assistant replied that the report sent to the hotel wasn't his. He didn't understand who could have uploaded the additional file. Chae-yoon became nervous and looked at her colleague's screen trying to figure out what was going on. Overall, it turned out that the file she saw the night before was not Park's assistant's work. Min-soo understood what the assistant was talking about and explained that he personally made some minor adjustments and he was very surprised that the team leader did this. Min-soo explained that he simply expanded on the ideas he had described and corrected some inaccuracies. Assistant Park, studying this file, realized that the words about the work being corrected or revealed were too modest because he saw a completely different work. Assistant Park immediately asked about the work of Manager Young, who by that time had not yet left his office interested in what was happening, and Min-soo noted that he had hardly touched his work. Manager Chan grinned slightly and said that the team leader had told him to find a similar task in old documents and he basically just copied the references because the data fit perfectly into the new format. Chae-yoon was shocked that the manager simply copied his work and didn't put in much effort. At first she thought that Manager Young was simply extremely motivated to work and Assistant Park had his own strengths. Now the girl heard in person that the manager admitted to copying an old document and the team leader called it excellent work. Chae-yoon's head suddenly started to hurt from the stress. She couldn't understand what was happening around her and didn't know how to work in such an environment. Manager Chan, having sorted out the whole situation, went for a much-needed smoke break, and Assistant Park followed him. The assistant said that the team leader completely redid his work and uploaded a new one without even telling him anything about it, to which the manager replied that apparently this was his work style. The assistant shared with the manager that on the one hand it was less of a hassle for him, but nevertheless he was very worried, but then he didn't answer anything. He couldn't say exactly why Tim the leader did this, because usually when the work of a junior person didn't meet standards, the senior person would scold him and show him where he had miscalculated because the company planned to continue working with the employee. The manager thought that perhaps the reason the team lead decided to redo the assistant's work was that it was much less troublesome for him to do everything himself than to teach someone else. In other words, improving the skills of his subordinates was far from the highest priority, and the manager thought that perhaps the leader did not care at all whether the employees gained experience. For the manager, it seemed as if an order had come from above to support the team's work only as long as the chairman's daughter was there. The manager quickly realized that right now ESG was a death pit, the purpose of which was to destroy the legacy of the weakened chairman. The manager now understood why Park Ji-hoon had been assigned to this department, including himself, who was on the verge of being fired, but he couldn't figure out how things were going with the team leader himself. The manager assumed that he was probably just a lackey fulfilling his role in this plan, but it was possible that he was in the same situation as he and the assistant. While on a smoke break, Manager Chan thought only about how the department he now worked in was a suicide squad, and he cursed everyone who was higher in rank. The manager tried to push all these thoughts aside because he still didn't want to waste any more emotions on this soulless work. This was not the first time something like this had happened to him. He had found himself in similar situations more than once from that same incident. Manager Chan generally understood what he had to do as well as how it could all end for both himself and his other colleagues. Stubbing out his cigarette and leaving it in the ashtray, Manager Chan thought it actually made things easier. He no longer had the strength to hold on. The manager stood by the ashtray for a while and looked extremely bad, which the assistant noticed and immediately approached him and called out to him. Assistant Park asked with concern whether the manager was okay, as he didn't look very well. The manager turned to him and smiled slightly, indicating that everything was fine. Well, the manager wasn't going to go back to the office and decided to smoke another cigarette, and the assistant stayed with him. Chae-yoon didn't go anywhere and stayed at her workplace all the time, thinking that she couldn't do anything about what was happening. She decided that she would simply try at her own pace, hoping that at least some result would come from it. The girl approached the leader and apologized for distracting him, stating that she had studied the entire manual he had given her. Min-soo looked at the girl with a slight surprise on his face and asked if she had really studied all the information. Chae-yoon looked very serious and confirmed her words. Min-soo was very surprised that she managed to do it in just one day, although he gave her a week and a half. He asked which of the main ESG assessment criteria were relevant to S, and the girl replied that firstly the health and safety of employees at the head office and partner companies, and the existence of an internal policy for the protection of human rights. The girl continued and added that secondly this included the existence of a joint growth program such as financial support for partners, and thirdly these were issues concerning tobacco, alcohol, weapons, and gambling. Min-soo asked what was going on with Ji, and Chae-yoon explained that it was management, or more precisely improving corporate governance, and first of all it concerned the issue issue of having a corporate charter and secondly the issue of having other organizations involved in activities in this area. In the third point, the girl began to highlight the topic of whether the CEO and senior management had been involved in corruption such as embezzlement, breach of trust, or taking a technical person over the past 3 years, and at this point the team lead stopped her. He asked her to talk about the guidelines that should be referred to when compiling the department's sustainable management reports, and the girl named 6 economic and 8 environmental points. She explained that based on detailed guidelines for compiling impact reports on topics including 19 social topics and sustainability reporting standards for 77 industries, the leader was very surprised by everything she said. He looked at her and asked if the girl had previously studied the documents of his department. Chaeyoon confirmed this, saying she'd been studying the information for about 2 days after receiving her assignment to his department. Min-soo was surprised that the girl had memorized everything so well. Chaeyoon noted that she had a good memory, and if she read or heard something it was hard for her to forget it, but even with a good memory, learning everything in a day would be a hassle. The girl clenched her fist in intense emotion and admitted that she was doing all this because of her desperate situation. Chaeyoon made a small bow as a sign of respect in front of that leader, and this surprised him even more. The girl noted that her words were the purest truth, and Min-soo looked at her with puzzlement. Chaeyoon also noted that this is precisely why she asks him to take her seriously. Min-soo certainly didn't expect this kind of behavior from the girl, having already assumed that she would be of little use. "I don't want to ask the girl about the rest in more detail." Min-soo emphasized that he understood everything and would take her seriously. The next working day began exactly the same as all the previous ones. Everyone was in their places and working diligently on the tasks assigned to them. Chaeyoon still felt uneasy and kept looking at the leader's topic. She was very worried about what she had said to him the previous day, but still felt a great relief. She understood that even though she hadn't revealed the details to him, she had in fact revealed the situation she was in. Chaeyoon hadn't yet even managed to find out for sure whether this leader was her uncle's puppet and was worried that she had acted too carelessly. But the girl also understood that she had no other choice. This was the only right decision. The girl was distracted from her disturbing thoughts by some rustling sounds, and she carefully raised her head and looked around the office. These leaders were approached and told that they had big problems, which Min-soo pointed out. He was asked if he had seen the news related to soya liquor, to which Manager Chan immediately responded, "I know what will happen next." Assistant Pak unfortunately looked at the team leader expecting some kind of answer from him. Min-soo surprisingly hadn't heard any news about the company. The newspapers reported that it was #1 in sales, but among the big 3, it was the only one that hadn't implemented eco-friendly distribution systems. The assistant read out that in the ESG concepts, fines were strictly applied to companies that produced harmful products such as alcohol, tobacco, and weapons, and the public reaction was extremely negative and their ESG team would have to intervene. Chaeyoon noted that they probably needed to contact soya liquor immediately, but Min-soo asked the staff not to worry and therefore just do what they were doing. Chaeyoon was indignant and noted that this was their job, and since the issue concerned ecology, they should at least take countermeasures. Min-soo did not answer immediately and made several manipulations on the computer. A moment later, he noted that the management department would soon contact them, and they had to continue their work. Chaeyoon sat down at her desk and felt even more awkward. She was worried that she had jumped to conclusions about her team leader. Now Chaeyoon thought that Min-soo had no attachment to the work he was doing, since he was calm in such a critical situation, and decided not to do anything. Silence fell over the department. Everyone was processing the news in their own way. Chaeyoon tried to figure out whether the team leader was acting this way simply because his responsibilities were once again a passive flow of tasks. She also suspected that he genuinely couldn't care less about anything other than maintaining a precise schedule. Her thoughts were interrupted by the phone ringing. The girl tensed up a bit. She couldn't even guess who could be calling her at such a time. Chaeyoon answered the phone and introduced herself as who she was and what department she was from. Then she confirmed something to the person she was talking to. The manager looked out from behind his monitor screen and looked at his colleague who had called and asked to be connected to the team leader. The girl stood up from her workplace and called out to the team leader. She informed him that the advertising director of Soya Liquor had called and wanted to speak with him. Hearing this, Min-soo asked her to pass him the phone. Min-soo answered the call immediately. The director once again noted who the leader had been dealing with and asked if he had seen today's article. The director leaned back in his chair and noted that this issue required a very delicate approach, so he decided it would be right to involve the ESG department. Min-soo asked what exactly the director meant, and he noted that the team leader knew that the media reaction, future countermeasures, and so on would be difficult, but his team would be able to solve such problems. Min-soo sharply replied that his boss hadn't dealt with such issues, but the director continued to insist and asked if the team leader had actually read the article, as its main topic was the environment. The director noted that, to be more specific, this concerned environmentally friendly logistics systems, but Min-soo responded by asking if this was an environmental issue. To the director's bewilderment, the leader repeated that he was asking whether this was really an environmental issue from his company's point of view. Chae-eun listened attentively to the conversations, trying to understand what exactly they were talking about. The director, in a more rude manner, asked the team leader to simply open the article and read it himself, noting that it could not have been related to anything else if not ecology, but Min-soo, on the contrary, insisted that it was related to something other than that. The director was indignant that they were simply trying to pull the wool over his eyes, noting that everything was written in black and white in the article, and Min-soo, slightly rolling his eyes, read the text of one of the articles. Min-soo emphasized that the problem was that soy liquor was simply set up while it was quietly sitting it out. The team leader believed that everything had started because of criticism that soy was a company that only cared about money and not about the environment. Assistant Park also tried to listen in on the conversation and the leader's words about how it was all a banal article that hit the top search results, which meant that PR specialists and a viral team were involved. Min-soo, having expressed his point of view, asked the director if he still thought that they were affected by an environmental problem, and even manager Jung was no longer indifferent to what was happening. Min-soo noted that, in his view, this was a media attack orchestrated by competitors as a marketing ploy in preparation for the peak summer season. Hearing this, Chae-eun sank into her seat. Min-soo was completely cold and noted that the subsidiary could handle such problems on its own, and asked if the director had any other questions for him. Min-soo also emphasized that if there were no questions for him, then his business had already sent sufficient materials within the framework of the proposal from ESG, and without waiting for an answer hung up. Min-soo really didn't like such a statement and demands from him and his department. His entire new team couldn't take their eyes off him. Their faces showed a ton of questions no one dared to ask. Assistant Park carefully and in a whisper asked Chae-eun if everything would be alright, to which the girl noted that in the end the team leader was absolutely right, but a different kind of problem arose. Assistant Park felt very uneasy and unsure how to handle the situation. He really hoped that their leader would have a much clearer picture of the situation and would be able to make the right decision. Soon the advertising director called again and wanted to speak with Tim, the department leader, and Min-soo asked to pass the phone to him without any objection. Min-soo introduced himself again, and the director noted that he would like to talk about their previous topic and asked the team leader to go down to the lower floor. The team leader didn't really like this request and didn't respond right away. I hope the director will add something else, but he remained silent. Assistant Park was completely shocked when he heard that the team leader asked the advertising director whether he could have said everything over the phone, since he couldn't leave his post for every call, even from a senior employee. Manager Chan was also surprised to hear his team leader talking to the director and clearly defining his boundaries. The advertising director, realizing that he would not be able to persuade Min-soo to come down to him, noted that he would go up to his department himself. The advertising director hung up the phone and was also very unhappy that he had to please team leader Min-soo in every possible way. The advertising director was very focused and even angry about the developing situation in his company. He walked slowly but with heavy steps towards the elevator. The advertising director burst into the ESG department shouting at Lee Min-soo. The advertising director practically flew up to the team leader's workstation, indignant that he had decided to joke with him and did not understand the situation they were in. Lee Min-soo looked up at the advertising director without any involvement, and while remaining completely calm noted that he didn't remember making a joke. The entire floor heard the screams and no one remained indifferent. Everyone immediately dropped to their work and began listening to what was happening in the ESG department. The director shouted that he didn't understand how it was possible to avoid the task and nitpick on details when peak sales season was just around the corner, to which the team leader replied that this didn't mean he had to perform tasks that weren't part of his responsibilities. The team leader noted that until now the ESG team had been engaged in planning meetings through documents, while the relevant departments were engaged in implementation. The director chuckled and asked if he was comfortable with these documents while his company was going bankrupt. The advertising director raised his voice again and said that Tim, the leader, should have been ashamed to swear in front of all his colleagues why was this department even needed if at the most crucial moment he refused to work. When the advertising director shouted that what he was doing should have been completely disbanded, Chae-eun began to think that he had gone too far, and that something more was probably going on. Chae-eun generally believed the advertising director was entirely right. But on the other hand, team leader had been single-handedly performing for the entire team until now. Even despite the difference in their positions, such an attitude was unacceptable. Min-soo looked at the director and emphasized that he had decided to make claims to the wrong person. Min-soo also noted that he did not personally create the ESG department, and moreover the director demanded subordination from him, considering that they worked in more than one area. The advertising director didn't immediately find a response to this. He too understood that Tim, the leader, was absolutely right. Min-soo continued and reminded that, as he had already said, his team only created a proposal and did not engage in implementation, and they did not have either the personnel structures or work regulations for this. Min-soo rose from his desk and approached the advertising director, noting that despite this he wanted the ESG team to take on sales in areas beyond their responsibilities, which would mean increased responsibility for delegating authority. Min-soo looked closely at the director and asked if he could take on such responsibility, which made the director hiss and emphasize that he only wanted the ESG department to help the company. Min-soo took half a step forward and continued to insist that he had been misunderstood. Min-soo repeated his question again, expecting to hear whether the director had enough authority to delegate such powers to the ESG department. Min-soo was completely confident and easily stated that the advertising director was overestimating his position. The advertising director was seething from the inside from such impudence and disobedience, but he understood perfectly well that he would not be able to achieve anything. Around the same time, the area in front of an important person's office was quite empty. Suddenly someone knocked on the large wooden doors of the office. The man who was sitting in this office at that moment was wiping his glasses and allowed the guest to enter. A young man appeared at the threshold and greeted the man before moving on. The young man's name was Kang Jun-woo, and he was the current general manager of Soya Liquor's sales department. As he walked toward the man's desk, he apologized for taking up his time. The man finished wiping his glasses and putting them on, assured that nothing terrible had happened and that he was ready to listen to Mr. Kan. The man's name was Park Ki-ju, vice chairman of Soya Group. He glanced at the manager and asked if he had developed countermeasures. The KAN manager, sitting down on a leather sofa, noted that this was a complex matter and clearly a planned attack, and that it would be effective for this incident to be handled by the Department of Specialists dealing with environmental issues, since their company was attacked under the pretext of ecology. Vice President Park took a sip of his coffee and thought about what the manager had told him. Manager Kan smiled and explained that he was talking specifically about the ESG department. The vice president looked at him and asked again what exactly the manager meant by this department, since their team only dealt with formal documents. The manager noted that it would nevertheless be a good idea to assign them this kind of task, since their team leader had previously handled environmental issues very well, and now with the arrival of newcomers under his leadership it would be a piece of cake. The vice president, after listening, asked what was going on with Soya Liquor, to which the manager replied that they would support them in every possible way, and as soon as the public calmed down, their company would begin developing countermeasures. The vice president readily agreed that the matter should be entrusted to the ESG department and asked the manager to go and do his own thing. But before manager Kan left the office, the vice president called out to him and asked him to wait a bit. He asked the manager if there was a girl named Chae-eun working in this ESG department. The manager confirmed that, according to his information, the girl did indeed work there. That's all the vice president wanted to know, and he finally let the manager go. Vice President Park had many issues that he was eager to resolve. The vice president thought that the ulterior motive of one of the people he knew was very obvious. But the vice president also thought that, if you think logically, shifting responsibility to the ESG department turned out to be an excellent strategy for Soya Liquor. The vice president thought that if the deal failed, everyone would blame ESG for incompetence. And this in turn would put an end to the annoying girl Kang Chae-eun, which is what many were trying to achieve. If the ESG department had somehow miraculously found a solution, that would also have been a good option, since Soya Liquor had covered the emerging crisis without even lifting a finger. The vice president also thought a lot about the candy manager who was slowly leaving his office. The vice president believed that this young manager had adopted a lot from his father and was quite the cunning fox. Kang Jun-woo was the fourth son of Soya Group Vice President Kang Tae-chung. Kang Jun-woo came into his office, collapsed into a chair, and sighed heavily. He thought long and hard about Lee Min-soo, team lead of the ESG department. He already knew this person wasn't easy and wouldn't do extra work. The manager studied the paper for a long time and continued to think about the current circumstances. Sometimes the manager would glance at his watch, waiting for some news to appear. Still waiting in vain, Kang Jun-woo called the advertising director's phone. The manager immediately noted that a lot of time had passed and inquired about the report he needed. He was very interested in whether the advertising director had completed the assigned task. Hearing the advertising director mumbling, the manager asked him to stop and simply explained to him how everything went, and then the director admitted that he had failed to complete the task. The director said that the leader stated that this task required a delegation of authority, and this required an order from a superior. The manager was very surprised when the director told him that, in the opinion of this leader, he lacked authority. Manager Kang was already very angry and asked if the leader had dared to tell the director that he did not have the authority to decide anything, and the director confirmed this and complained about the conversation with Min Soo. The advertising director apologized and noted that he was very ashamed. Manager Kang said nothing but asked what the name of Tim, the ESG leader, was. It was at that moment that the manager learned everything about this person and what he would have to work with next. The advertising director noted that they would likely have to handle the article themselves, but the manager emphasized that they would still hand it over to the ESG team. The advertising director asked how they would do this, and the manager noted that they were talking about authority, and in that case they would delegate it to the team leader. The manager liked the idea of giving authority and greater responsibility to the leader even more as a solution to his problem. As he spoke, he looked at the entry in his notebook about the vice president and thought of something. Now the manager had no choice but to wait. He remained in his office chewing gum while thinking about many things. Manager Kan was already anticipating the outcome of the transfer of authority and power to this interesting team leader. The vice chairman at the same time was also trying to complete all his tasks and dialed one of the departments on the phone. The man was very surprised when he was told that team leader Min Soo had already left his workplace and that it would not be possible to contact him. Thinking he was mistaken, the vice chairman looked at his wristwatch and saw that only 5 minutes had passed since working hours were officially over. The vice chairman was very surprised that they had just gotten into a scandal, but the leader still left work on time and did not stay for a minute. The vice chairman instructed his assistant to also try to contact this person, but according to her, he did not answer calls or respond to any messages. The vice chairman was nervous and asked about the other employees, hoping that perhaps the manager could remain at work, but it was soon discovered that he was no longer in the office. The chairman remembered that the junior and assistant pack should have been there too, and he also learned that he was already absent from work. Soon the vice chairman managed to find out that the only person left at work from the entire department was the chairman's daughter, Kang Chaeun. The assistant who spoke with the vice chairperson noted that Chaeun had asked if she should take on the job. But the man couldn't understand how the manager's superior and assistant had simultaneously left the office, leaving only the newcomer. Usually when such incidents occurred, even part-time workers hesitated to leave work on schedule. The vice chairman understood that at this rate the fire would only escalate. The man asked his assistant to forget about everything and tell Chae-un not to come, but just at that moment the secretary reported that she had gone to his office. The vice chairman was not very happy that Chae-un intended to talk to him personally and cursed. He had nowhere to go, so he allowed Chae-un to come into his office, and she immediately appeared on his doorstep. The vice chairman invited the girl in and sat down in one of the empty chairs opposite him. He looked very nervous. The vice chairman looked at the girl and thought that she was just a poor, unfortunate child who had found herself in the wrong circumstances. The man also noted that the girl's face showed how difficult it was for her. When she came closer, he asked why she was alone in her department. Chae-un explained that she needed to work on a couple of details, and when the vice chairman asked about the others, the girl responded that they were the first to leave, which caused a wave of indignation in him about their irresponsibility. Chae-un was indignant, noting that it was not at all about their irresponsibility, and the vice chairman chuckled and looked at her questioningly. The man asked what the matter was, and Chae-un showed him the paper and noted that it contained proposals from the ESG department for resolving the issue with the high-profile article, and that they had previously been sent to the soya liquor team. Chae-un noted that since the evaluation and implementation of the proposed solutions rested with the subsidiary's responsibility for completing the task automatically transferred to soya liquor. She then handed the papers over to the vice chairperson. After reviewing the papers, the man asked if that was why the rest of the team had left the office without hesitation, and Chae-un confirmed this, also noting that there were no more reasons to stay late. Chaeyoon also emphasized that their topic leader had already clearly outlined the department's position, but the vice chairman immediately interrupted the girl, asking whether Soya Liquor had contacted them directly to resolve this issue. Chaeyoon said that it was not a request but an order, and the director of Soya Liquor personally came to their department. At that moment, the vice president learned what had actually happened and why manager Kang Jun-woo had come to see him. Soya Liquor hoped to shift the blame to ESG, as this was the easiest solution to the pressing problem. It would have been easy to simply hand over the most unpleasant tasks to this department and blame them if necessary. But thanks to its leader Min-soo, this department turned out to be far from the easiest target. The vice president noted that it appeared that team leader had used this rhetoric in his refusal. The vice president understood that even after Kang Jun-woo's words were repeated, he couldn't counter them, and naturally the Soya Liquor director was crushed on the spot. The vice chairman doubted that even Kang Jun-woo could get out of this situation, since the leader had masterfully used the terms to his advantage, leaving his opponent with no chance. The chairman clearly noted to himself that not everyone was capable of such a thing, and that he had greatly underestimated Lee Min-soo. After listening to Chaeyoon, the vice chairperson noted that the girl could walk, which it seemed she certainly did not expect to hear. Chaeyoon noted that she only wanted to say that if the vice chairman delegated the necessary powers to them, then their team could solve the problem, but the man adjusting his glasses asked the girl in a more rude manner to leave his office. Chaeyoon didn't argue with him and picked up all her papers and decided to leave. The vice chairman tried to figure out what he should do next because everything was not going as he wanted. For the sake of the chairman, he hoped to protect Chaeyoon until she got back on her feet. Well, no matter how much they protected the girl, she got involved in this field too early, and now it was very difficult to help her. Chaeyoon had been at work for more than half an hour, but she felt she should have worked longer. She was completely alone in the office. It was very quiet, broken only by the ringing of the telephone. Chaeyoon tried her best to call the leader, but his phone was not answered. The girl was worried because she believed that she should have told him about what was happening as soon as possible. There was only one reason why the vice chairman would want to contact the team leader, and that was to delegate a task to him. Chaeyoon understood that the chairman had fired her because if he had given her the task, it would have meant handing over the job to the chairman's daughter, and this would have created unnecessary misunderstandings in a situation that required a quick solution. Since it was an order from the vice chairman himself, the leader had to make a concession, at least that's what Chaeyoon thought. Chaeyoon felt very depressed thinking about everything that was happening. She was in despair. Chaeyoon heard distant voices in the hallway. Some employees were talking about someone, most likely the team leader, who had put on quite a show. One of the guys said that Tim was always like that as a leader and such behavior was not at all surprising, while the other thought that he was just a taciturn and quiet employee. The first of the guys confirmed that the leader was indeed quiet, but noted that when it came to a conflict of interest, he was not to be trifled with. The guy said that as soon as the ESG department was formed, similar incidents occurred almost regularly, and the leader cracked boss after boss like nuts. Overall, it was logical because what could be done if the topic leader calmly poured out indisputable facts on his opponents? The guys continued talking about how the director had to find a way to shut up a simple employee. One of them noted that this did not work on the leader's topics, and the ESG department was too isolated from other teams and was almost outside the hierarchy. One of the guys wondered what they could do in that case except resign themselves to it, because by arguing and marking time they could only harm themselves, wasting unnecessary nerves and time for planning. Another employee recalled a very interesting incident from the past, when the second team had an urgent matter, but Lee Min-soo as usual left work early, and no matter how many times they called him, he did not answer. Chaeyoon listened even more attentively to this conversation when an employee asked another if he could imagine what the team had done. The employee said that the team asked HR for the address and went straight to his home themselves, and these words really helped Chaeyoon at that moment. The two boys continued to do their work and discuss the situation, and Chaeyoon immediately got up from the table and began to get ready. The guys heard some rustling and were very surprised that there was someone else in the office, but they did not have time to notice Chaeyoon, who very quickly left. The guys quickly let go of the situation and continued to discuss the story that happened in the past with Lee Min-soo, and it turned out that the team leader simply treated the team to food and promised to do everything in the morning. Lee Min-soo, I really never took work matters to heart and thought that everything should be done only during work hours. Lee Min-soo was very surprised when, while walking down the street under an umbrella, due to the pouring rain, he saw a familiar face in front of him. Chaeyoon, without bothering to take the reins, stood on the porch of one of the houses in front of her leader and covered herself with only a bag from the rain. Lee Min-soo stopped and turned to the girl and asked what she was doing in this place at such a time. Before meeting Chae-eun, Lee Min-soo managed to go into a supermarket where a Soya Group advertisement was being shown. The advertisement said that summer sales were about to take effect, and while choosing the right products, Min-soo thought that sudden changes almost always had a reason. He thought about his new colleagues and the fact that the department he'd launched was suddenly being transferred to 3 new employees. To his department, the choice of candidates that he received was very illogical because these employees were very weak in their knowledge. What was more important in the preconditions for the changes was that the daughter of the chairman of Soya Group was transferred to his department. Lee Min-soo knew perfectly well that the incident that occurred during work hours was also not an accident, since they decided to dump the morning article on them only at the end of the workday. From the outside it looked like they couldn't handle it themselves, but since one of the directors of Soya Liquor had stepped up, the case was clearly not trivial, and what's more, the chairman's nephew worked for the company. Min-soo had heard rumors about this nephew. He was described as a shrewd and calculating young man. From all this, one could conclude that the reason was Kang Chae-eun herself. At the moment, the girl was the chairman's extremely vulnerable heir, whom her experienced rival was trying to get rid of before she gained influence. And such a clash always led to a larger chain of events. When Lee Min-soo saw Chae-eun, whom he had been thinking about the whole way, he was a little confused. He couldn't even imagine why the girl had found his house, because there could have been many reasons. Min-soo asked the girl what was wrong, and immediately pointed out that he wouldn't let her spend the night. Chae-eun, looking down at the floor, declared that she had something to tell him. Well, instead of listening to what Chae-eun was worried about, Min-soo asked what was wrong with her appearance and told her that when she came here he was not at home and he decided to come back, but suddenly it started to rain heavily. Min-soo came to the table under the porch and folded his umbrella, and only then asked what kind of urgent matter it was that made the girl come in person. Chae-eun said that the vice chairman was looking for Min-soo right after he left the office, and since no one else from the department was there except her, she decided to go talk to him. Min-soo didn't react to this statement and merely asked if Chae-eun liked mung bean pancakes. She was so confused that she didn't immediately understand what he meant. Min-soo looked at her and noted that if she was hungry she could go inside with him. The two of them went to the top floor to the apartment where Min-soo lived. He handed the girl an umbrella when they reached the roof and entered the apartment. Chae-eun remained outside, hesitating to enter, even though Min-soo immediately invited the girl inside. Chae-eun looked around. The rooftop where the team leader's apartment was located offered a magnificent view of the city. Min-soo quickly returned for Chae-eun, having already changed his clothes, and asked if the girl was going to continue standing outside. Chae-eun entered Min-soo's apartment and apologized for invading his territory, but Min-soo only handed her a towel so she could dry her hair. While Chae-eun was trying to dry her hair, Min-soo asked her to also take off her socks so as not to wet the entire floor. Min-soo immediately started preparing dinner, and Chae-eun felt awkward, noting that he shouldn't have bothered because she could have eaten at home, but he asked her to wait a little, promising that he would cook. Chae-eun didn't argue any further and stopped to watch Min-soo's actions as he mixed the pancake ingredients in a bowl. Min-soo turned to his guest and asked if she knew how to cook. Chae-eun honestly admitted that she didn't really know how to cook anything, and after Min-soo asked me if she ever cooked, she admitted that she never did. Min-soo waved to the side and asked if Chae-eun had seen the blender that was under the rice cooker and asked her to turn it on. Chae-eun took out the blender and checked to make sure she hadn't made a mistake before turning it on. Min-soo glanced at it and replied that she had gotten the right ingredients. Min-soo asked Chae-eun to fill a mug with water and pour it all into the blender, then turn on the fourth mode to chop. While searching for how to enable this mode on the blender, Chae-eun wondered what her team leader was doing at home. She thought that a person who was obsessed with efficiency would probably prefer to buy ready-made food rather than cook it themselves. Min-soo asked to turn off the blender after less than half a minute, and Chae-eun noted that there were still large pieces left. I think it was worth chopping more, but Min-soo assured that this was enough. Chae-eun asked if he was sure, since the pieces were quite large, to which Min-soo explained that if they were chopped any finer the food would become tasteless. For the mung bean loblins, moderate chopping was enough. Min-soo stirred the dough with a spoon, checking its consistency, and explained that they risked increasing the density too much, thereby making the dish hard and with a poor texture. Min-soo looked at Chae-eun and asked if the girl understood what he was talking about, to which she clarified whether it was all something like hash browns, which was an American dish that consisted of finely chopped or grated potatoes that were fried in a pan in the form of pancakes. Min-soo noted that this could be the case, but in any case the mashed dough should have been ground as if on a millstone to create air pockets for a nutty flavor and a pleasant texture. Chaeyoon, why did you become sad, and noted that it really looked like hash browns, but Min-soo asked the girl to put that thought aside because they should have made pancake sauce. Min-soo, I said that it was worth taking 1 tablespoon of vinegar and water. Add half a coffee spoon of sugar to these ingredients and stir until the sugar is completely dissolved. After the sugar dissolved, it was time to add the chopped pepper and onion. Chaeyoon diligently tried to follow Min-soo's instructions. While the girl was making sauce for the pancakes, Min-soo was busy frying them in a frying pan. It really didn't take long to make these pancakes. Min-soo quickly set the table and invited Chaeyoon to sit down and start dinner. Min-soo also took out a small bottle and poured the contents into Chaeyoon's glass, for which she thanked him but continued to feel awkward. Min-soo felt as always very free and relaxed and was glad to finally have dinner. Chaeyoon took one of the pancakes and dipped it in the sauce, thinking about what the team leader's cooking tasted like. Chaeyoon put the first pancake into her mouth. Having tasted the pancake, the girl was very surprised. The pancakes were crispy on the outside and soft on the inside, all accompanied by a buttery flavor that was interrupted by a harmony of peppers and onions just before the dish could become too greasy. Min-soo glanced at Chaeyoon and asked if she liked his pancakes, and she replied that the food was delicious and became slightly embarrassed. Min-soo explained that another important ingredient was lard, and that it was necessary to use enough lard so that the pancakes would float in it. Min-soo also explained that if too little was added, the dish could become soggy and chewy, and the lard was needed to allow the air pockets in the beans to settle properly. A small pile of plastic bottles soon accumulated near the table. Chaeyoon had already relaxed and brightened up. Taking a sip, she asked where Min-soo had learned to cook so well. Min-soo responded by asking the girl to stop drinking, as she could soon get drunk, but Chaeyoon laughed and indignantly assured that she was not drunk at all. At that moment, Min-soo reminded him that the girl had come to tell him something, and the smile on Chaeyoon's face immediately disappeared. Chaeyoon put her head on her lap and covered her face, asking the team leader if they could take on this case. Min-soo asked Chaeyoon what the vice chairman had told her. He needed to know everything before jumping to any conclusions. Chaeyoon noted that the vice chairman hadn't said anything to her personally, but she understood that he intended to entrust them with the soya liquor issue, and there was hardly any other reason why he would look for Min-soo after work hours. Min-soo clarified that this meant that the vice chairman had not shared anything with her, and she sadly replied that he had not wanted to talk to her at all, and that she was apparently the wrong person. Min-soo told Chaeyoon that they would figure it out, and that was a small hope for her. Chaeyoon jumped up and asked the team leader to confirm he was serious. Min-soo glanced at her and asked why she was so surprised. Chaeyoon explained that she had heard him earlier so easily refuse the director, and Min-soo explained in response that he did it because the unqualified department director began to exceed his authority. Min-soo emphasized that in any case work was work, and the essence did not change from one task to another, and Chaeyoon thought about it after hearing this. Min-soo acted easy and continued tucking into his dinner. When the girl didn't respond, he asked if she had anything else she wanted to discuss. Chaeyoon admitted that she needed recognition from all the senior directors, right down to the company's shareholders. The girl directly said that she wanted to announce her presence to them, and also shared that it became clear to her that Min-soo was able to impress ESG as an extremely effective department. Chaeyoon looked down and asked Min-soo to help her, since apparently no one else could do it. Min-soo, as if nothing serious had been said, continued to eat dinner, only noting that all that was left was to work. After finishing dinner, Min-soo stood up and let Chaeyoon know that he would send her all the materials on this issue via messenger, and asked her not to overdo it, shouting that she would do a good job, but to just do everything as before. Carrying the plate to the kitchen, Min-soo explained that overenthusiasm could backfire on inexperienced employees. Chaeyoon thanked him but asked what he meant by saying she should have done things the way she had before. Min-soo returned to her and pointed his finger at her, noting that he meant cooking pancakes, and then explained that she should do everything he told her. Returning to the execution, Min-soo also explained that when he said he would work on it, it did not mean that he was going to support her, and that everything would fit within the scope of his work duties. Chaeyoon asked if this meant that he would not help her, and Min-soo replied that he did not do favors for people and had no desire to win anyone's recognition. At that moment, Min-soo said that if Chaeyoon had already eaten, then it was time for her to go home. Chaeyoon rolled her eyes in displeasure and asked if she could stay and eat some pancakes, adding that they had something to drink. Min-soo turned to her and asked if she had said everything she wanted about work, and Chaeyoon assured him that it was everything and admitted that she simply really liked his cooking. Min-soo asked her how she felt about the kimchi tofu before leaving, noting he'd be washing all the dishes himself. Chaeyoon smiled and without even thinking of objecting offered to help. Chaeyoon thought of Min-soo as a person who didn't seek recognition and left work on time every day. Min-soo was a man who didn't want privileges but only wanted to enjoy the things he loved at the same time, and he was masterful in his duties. This was the true nature of team leader Lee Min-soo, who seemed strange to Chaeyoon at first. Chaeyoon couldn't take her eyes off him during their second dinner in a row. Min-soo noticed her gaze and asked if she wanted to say something. The girl immediately looked away, assuring him she hadn't. She thought about how to gain such an ally. She realized she needed to focus on his life outside of work. A new working day began, which could bring absolutely any news. Min-soo arrived, as always, at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning when the whole team was still assembled. Min-soo didn't have time to undress and sit down at the chopsticks before he received a call on his work phone. The team leader received a call from the vice chairman. Min-soo wasn't particularly pleased, but he continued the conversation anyway since he had no other option. The vice chairman complained that he couldn't reach him by phone yesterday because he left work early. He noted that he didn't blame him for this and immediately announced that the ESG firm was supposed to take on the soy liquor problem. Min-soo did not argue with him and agreed, but added that however to work more effectively, they would need authority beyond the soy liquor departments. The chairman noted that Min-soo and his team would receive authority, but they had to take into account that they would also have responsibilities. Min-soo emphasized his understanding, and the vice chairman then asked them to get to work. Before hanging up, the vice chairman asked the team leader to remind him of his name. Min-soo stated his full name, to which the chairman thanked him and wished him success in his work. Chaeyoon, as soon as the team leader hung up, asked what happened in the end, and he easily answered that they were taking on the task. Min-soo will explain to the others that they were supposed to close the soy liquor issue that arose yesterday morning, as it was a direct order from the vice chairman. Min-soo glanced at the team and noted that he and Kang Chaeyoon would be taking on the task, and he instructed the manager and assistant to complete all the department's other tasks, specifically assigning the manager the task of distributing the work. The assistant was very surprised by this turn of events and looked at Manager Chan, although on the other hand he was glad that he would not have to take on such a serious job. Manager Chan was not happy with his job, although he initially understood that he would hardly be able to take on such tasks. Assistant Park called out to the team leader and asked who was responsible for evaluating the work, and Min-soo immediately replied that this task was also assigned to the manager. Min-soo noted that Manager Jung had to collect all the work and bring it to him for approval, and then asked the team to get to work. The bank assistant glanced at Chaeyoon, who looked more pleased than usual, but there was also a trace of worry on her face. Min-soo turned to Assistant Park, who, not expecting to hear his name again, shuddered. Manager Chung turned to him and asked him to take a pen and invited him to sit next to him. The manager asked the assistant if Tim had seen a leader in his previous job and if he understood their structure. The assistant mumbled something unintelligible in response. Manager Chan, immediately realizing what this meant, was very shocked that the assistant still did not understand the format of the work and asked how many completed tasks he had reviewed. Assistant Pak tried to remember, looking at the clock in the back of his head, and replied that he had looked at 5 or 4 works, and also added that he had his own works. Manager Jong quickly became furious at Assistant Park for being so irresponsible. The manager jumped up from his seat screaming and indignant at why the assistant thought that these were purely his work, since the leader had approved them only because he was redoing his trash. Chaeyoon couldn't stand such a scandal and looked at this scene, even feeling guilty. The manager looked at Chaeyoon and called out to her. The girl knew she was about to be reprimanded. The manager scowled at the girl and asked how many entries she'd seen. Chaeyoon, after a moment's hesitation, replied that she'd seen 19 entries by now. The manager then asked how she was doing with the manual. Assistant Pak was completely dejected, realizing he had truly been the weakest and most irresponsible, especially after the girl replied that she had completely memorized all the manuals. Manager Chan looked at his assistant and asked if he heard his colleague. The manager immediately asked what the assistant had been doing at that moment. He started cursing and suggested that he was either clueless or from a wealthy family, and if he had neither, he should just bury his head in the sand. The manager emphasized that each of them would fulfill 2 current requests and asked if there were any objections. Assistant Pak, even afraid to look at the manager, said he had no objections. The manager asked the assistant to find topics on a similar topic among those created by team leader and determine their structure and format, as well as to ensure they were done efficiently. He also advised asking immediately if he felt things weren't working out, even for fear of being reprimanded. Chae-eun immediately got to work, but before she could even begin, she heard her work phone ringing. The girl picked up the phone and introduced her name and department. Min-soo immediately paid attention to this call, and he became very interested in what Chae-eun was talking about and most importantly with whom. Chae-eun immediately responded and noted that the person looking for the leader was Kang Jun-woo, the general manager of the soya liquor sales department. Min-soo understood that this conversation might not be the easiest, so he immediately got dressed and went to meet this manager. Kang Jun-woo heard a knock at his door and briefly replied that he could come in. He himself was sitting in one of the chairs in his office chewing gum, as he always did. Min-soo cautiously entered the office and apologized for disturbing everyone. This was the company's custom. Kang Jun-woo noted that he was very glad to see him and asked him to sit down in one of the empty seats. As soon as the leader sat down, the general manager noted that he had been informed that the ESG department had taken on the task, and since peak sales season was just around the corner, he was a little worried about the results. Kang Jun-woo noted that this was precisely why he wanted to know what the team leader was planning to do and asked if he himself would be willing to share his plans. Min-soo was very serious as always and looked at the manager and asked what specific details he wanted to know, and he replied that first of all he would like to hear plans for the environmental issue. Min-soo replied that it was far from the most urgent matter, which immediately attracted the general manager's interest. Min-soo explained that what the company suffered yesterday was a media attack. He explained that this was a strategy most often employed by underperforming companies. Market leaders rarely initiated such an attack because it created a negative impression of an attempt to crush a smaller competitor. Min-soo emphasized that if we started making excuses at such a moment, the company could fall into even deeper trouble and competitors would start clinging to every word to make everything look bad. It was hard to put an end to this because as soon as the excuses ended, another attack immediately followed. Kang Jun-woo asked the team leader what they should have done in that case and what the market leader's response should be, to which Min-soo replied that they should have launched a media attack themselves. Min-soo believed that it was worth carrying out an even more sophisticated attack than the one that their competitors had organized, and they had to create a real swamp in which everyone would drown, and when everyone around was under attack, the weak would go first. Min-soo watched the general manager closely but continued speaking, noting that after the first part was completed it would be possible to begin clearing the reputation, and it would be necessary to monitor trends and public opinion in order to promptly publish a refutation. Min-soo emphasized that this was only a superficial explanation and asked if there were any further questions. Jun-woo replied that the plan sounded quite reasonable and asked the team leader to begin implementing it. Min-soo immediately hurried out of the office and in an instant found himself at the front door. Before heading out into the corridor, Min-soo turned around and remarked that he had been puzzled yesterday when he learned that the general manager had not implemented any of his department's suggestions. The general manager wanted to explain, but the leader noted that he was not trying to criticize him but only wanted to say that they should have used the ready-made sketches. Min-soo paused for a moment and asked if the general manager had objected to this, to which he replied that they had planned to use them anyway, and that was how it should be done. Min-soo opened the front door, noted that then they would all stop at this very plan. Kang Jun-woo was incredibly displeased with this conversation and his introduction to this ESG department leader. He gritted his teeth in anger and could hardly wait for the team leader to leave. Min-soo returned to his department quite calmly, generally pleased with himself, but he didn't like the general manager either. Approaching his department, Min-soo heard a very familiar voice that immediately interested him. Entering the office, he heard and saw that Chae-eun was talking to someone on the phone, again her voice sounding very puzzled. When the girl hung up, Min-soo approached her and asked who she had been talking to. Chae-eun looked at him with some fear on her face and said that she spoke with the PR office, which invited them to the hearing. Min-soo was very surprised and asked what the girl meant. This was a legislative hearing on decarbonization which will be held 3 times in total. They requested the presence of an additional witness and they asked which of the proposed dates Min-soo and his team could attend. Chaeyoon looked at the team leader whose face was very difficult to read and asked what she should have answered to the PR office. Min-soo, to her great surprise, smiled broadly, realizing that this hearing was to his advantage. As a result, it turned out that at first work was desperately pushed onto their department, even a scandal was created through the director, and then they inquired about their plans but did not mention the details until the very end. Everyone was just pretending to be ignorant fools, avoiding losses and keeping an eye on their actions. They shifted responsibility to ESG, maintaining their presence, and tried to control them, but at the same time, in the event of a bad outcome, they would be out of the picture. Chaeyoon, without waiting for a response from the leader, explained that if they refused to participate without a good reason, they would be punished, and what's more, journalists would probably pounce on them like fresh meat. Chaeyoon mentioned the general manager's name and asked what he said to the team leader. Min-soo walked to her workplace and took off her jacket and replied that the general manager was with him. I said nothing special, pretending that I didn't know anything. Chaeyoon was indignant, noting that she was sure that the general manager had deliberately kept something he had agreed to, and the leader, Tim, emphasized that he would have made a good actor. Well, that was even for the best, since they were expecting a live broadcast on television. The leader then asked Chaeyoon to tell the PR office that they would appear on the 6th. Chaeyoon was worried that these leaders' plans would only work if the hearing went well. Chaeyoon responded to the leader that she would sign them up for the 6th, but she was terribly worried about it. Before calling, the girl thought for a moment and suddenly jumped up and shouted that the 6th was already the next day. Min-soo didn't express any concern whatsoever. He believed the sooner it happened, the better. He believed that Soya Liquor would not take action until after the first hearing, and they would get rid of the problem in one shot. Min-soo also understood that, of course, this did not concern the companies competing with them, but Kang Jun-woo and the mess he had created. Min-soo thought that the moment the general manager dared to play with him, he passed a sentence on himself. Min-soo didn't care what position he held. He was ready to do everything possible to bring this man to justice. Min-soo realized from the first glance that this man was dangerous. The team leader promised himself that he would destroy Kang Jong-woo and had a rough idea of how to do it. The general manager, upon hearing that Min-soo and his team were going to attend the hearing the next day, was very surprised but also dissatisfied. The advertising director confirmed this, noting that the official notification had already been sent, and that this was accurate information. The advertising director noted that, judging by the lack of instructions and the lack of media coverage from their department, it seemed they were planning to wrap things up quickly at the next event. The general manager, upon hearing this, noted that the director was free to go. At first, General Manager Kang Jun-woo thought that the leader was just a straightforward guy, but now he got the feeling that he was just crazy. Jong-woo was surprised that the team leader's own suggestion was to first launch a counter-media attack and only then take action. In any case, it wasn't that important, because if this psychopath suddenly causes a mess at the hearing, he himself will be the one to blame, and that was precisely the purpose of the ESC, namely to take all the blame on himself. But the general manager was still seething with anger. Or perhaps the gum he constantly chewed helped him control his temper a little. He could chew gum well, savor the taste, and spit it out as soon as it became tasteless or he got tired of it. He also equated chewing gum with the people he controlled and exploited. Meanwhile, work was in full swing in the ESG department. Chaeyoon and the leader were working on specific tasks, while the manager was struggling to get everyone to handle Park's assistant's work. Chaeyoon kept hearing how Manager Jung was picking on the assistant's work. It was surprising that he sent such raw work to the leader. The manager noted all the assistant's mistakes and asked him to explain each of his steps, and also asked him to name some rules, trying to make the assistant understand everything on his own. The manager, who was already struggling to keep his composure, asked what the difference was between the work of a pack assistant and a team leader. I understand that the assistant will never answer. The manager explained that it was a matter of statistics and that the leader always worked with specific number-cited standards and only then moved on. The assistant's work, however, was more like a mixture of superficial analysis and personal opinion. At that very moment, Min-soo stood up from his desk and noted that he needed to step out for a while, and that Chaeyoon could contact him if anything happened. Chaeyoon silently noted everything that was happening around her, and the fact that the assistant was getting scolded by Manager Jung all day. The leader was obviously busier than usual, as he even had to leave his workplace. This is how the most intense days of the ESG department's work passed since Chaeyoon joined. But something still remained strange to her. She thought that if this had happened at any other time she would have been very worried or wondering what her team leader could possibly think of her. She kept remembering the conversation with Min-soo at his house when he asked her to compare everything to cooking pancakes and to do only what he said. Chae-eun now felt that if she just followed him the problem would be solved, and she also laughed at herself because she really wanted to eat his pancakes. She thought that as soon as they closed this case she would like to ask the team leader to treat her again. The entire department as well as the entire company worked diligently until the evening. Everyone was nervous about the situation. The man sat in his office staring thoughtfully at his laptop screen, sighing heavily every now and then. The man looked through all the news publics on the internet and was surprised that there was not a single post yet that was a loyal one. One could only conclude that the ESG department intended to respond at tomorrow's hearing, and of course such an approach had great risks, but in such a crisis situation it seemed a better solution than trying to deny it. Naturally, this was only on the condition that everything worked out. The man kept trying to guess what Min-soo's next move would be. The man thought for a moment, took a landline telephone from the table and dialed a number. At that moment Chae-eun's phone rang for the umpteenth time that day. The girl carefully picked up the phone and after introducing herself heard that the vice chairman had contacted her. The chairman immediately asked to pass the phone to this leader. Chae-eun, a little confused, noted that the leader had already gone home, which puzzled the vice chairman. He started to scold the leader for leaving work so early again, and then he looked at his watch and saw that it was already 6 o'clock in the evening. The chairwoman refused to back down and asked the girl in a commanding tone to return the team leader back to his workplace, but Chae-eun, already more collected, replied that this was extremely problematic. She explained to the vice chair that it was impossible to reach the team leader after work hours, which was even more shocking. He couldn't understand how the team leader could so loudly proclaim authority and responsibility, so he simply up and left work. The vice chairman now realized that there was no other option but to call in the emergency response team, not paying particular attention to the fact that Chae-eun on behalf of this leader promised to solve this problem and simply asked for trust. The vice chairman indignantly asked why he should trust her, and Chae-eun emphasized that she did everything in her power and her personal future depended on how she handled this task. These words calmed the vice chairman a little because there was still something truthful in them. He imagined this confused, frightened little girl before his eyes and thought that it was time to cool down a little. The vice chairman hung up, saying that he would wait. He certainly found it hard to believe, but it all looked as if the ESG department had a plan, and it was unlikely that the team leader would have left so early without a winning move. But the chairman still couldn't figure out what the team leader had planned. He had much more interesting questions. The vice chairman was very interested in what kind of person Lee Min-soo was. No one knew anything about him beyond his work-related activities. The next day was the hearing. It was a very important event for the entire company. But now the employees' meeting took place not in the office but in the underground parking garage. Chae-eun and Min-soo also met in the underground parking lot and after greeting each other immediately got into the car. Min-soo, while fastening his seatbelt, asked Chae-eun if she had prepared everything, and she assured him that everything was fine. Min-soo, completely calm, started the car and suggested they leave immediately. Chae-eun felt very tense, but she hoped everything would work out. As soon as they pulled out of the parking lot, the girl's thoughts became more disturbing. Min-soo was driving very sharply and literally floored the gas. While Chae-eun was driving in the car, she thought that it was probably not easy for this row of a small department to live in this world. But soon she learned about his income. The car drove fast for a very short time because soon they got stuck in a small morning traffic jam. Chae-eun continued to worry about the upcoming hearing, but at the same time she felt very awkward. The girl kept looking around in all directions and examining Tim Lid's car. Turning around, Chae-eun saw Finn's a wetsuit and masks on the back seat and asked if he was a scuba diver. Min-soo corrected her, noting that he was a free diver. Chae-eun looked at him in surprise and asked what the difference was, and he explained that he was diving without an air tank, which immediately made the girl ask how he was breathing. Min-soo replied in his usual style that you could die if you tried to breathe underwater. Chae-eun already regretted asking and rolled her eyes, but still her curiosity got the better of her, and she asked if this activity was too dangerous, to which Tim, the leader, explained that everything was fine if you followed the rules. He glanced at Chae-eun and asked why she was so interested. Chae-eun became even more awkward and replied that she had simply asked because she saw the equipment. In fact, she was worried that she had given herself away, since conversations outside of working hours were always an opportunity to get closer to that leader. Min-soo asked the girl if she had any other questions, and this made her even more confused. After thinking for a moment, Chai-un asked if the leader had any other hobbies that morning besides cooking and freediving. The leader frowned slightly and asked why did the girl suddenly ask him such questions. Chai-un grimaced, noting that he himself had given her permission to ask any question. Min-soo explained that he was referring to the questions regarding today's hearing and that Chai-un wanted to simply disappear while sitting on the seat of his car. The girl turned to the window and replied that she had no more questions because she remembered everything he told her yesterday. I probably already knew the answer, but Min-soo still asked if Chai-un was worried about the hearing. Chai-un replied with a heavy sigh that she already felt much better. The girl thought about the fact that it was clear from the start that Tim, the leader, was indeed very strange. The strange thing about it was that no matter how much the situation changed, the leader always remained calm, and you couldn't tell from him that they were going to a hearing. I remember Chai-un's words about how work was work and that the essence of it didn't change from one task to another. It felt like this hearing was just an extra assignment, but that was probably why, with that leader by her side, Chai-un felt like they could handle almost any task. They soon arrived at their destination. Min-soo parked, got out of the car, and urged Chai-un on. Chai-un obeyed and immediately got out of the car after him. She tried to set herself up for the best possible outcome. She decided to follow only that leader without rushing forward unnecessarily and keeping up with his leisurely gait. Min-soo was determined to tear apart anyone who dared speak to him improperly. At the same time, he truly felt completely calm. Min-soo and Chai-un met them in the corridor and showed them where to go. It was Chai-un's first time at such an event, and she looked around with interest. They entered a huge conference room. Each participant had a personal microphone. The room was very crowded and the tense atmosphere was palpable. There were also a lot of journalists present in the hall who naturally could not miss such an opportunity. Before the conference began, everyone began to sit down in their seats and many were discussing something among themselves. Min-soo looked at absolutely everyone with suspicion, trying to feel the prevailing atmosphere a little and anticipate the development of events. The hearing soon began, and the moderator, shuffling through papers, said that a committee member had previously noted that Korea's transition to decarbonization was significantly lagging behind that of developed countries. The man noted that carbonization was no longer an option but a matter of survival, and at such a critical moment he resolutely condemned the deviation from the management code and declared the hearing open. Lee Min-soo's name was the first to be mentioned at the hearing. The team leader, completely calm and collected, responded immediately. The presenter asked whether he represented Soya Group at this hearing, and Min-soo confirmed this. The host asked Min-soo to put the materials on the screen. At that very moment, the projector hanging on the ceiling was turned on. An image of several large trucks appeared on the screen, and the presenter asked witness Lee Min-soo if he knew what was shown in the image. Min-soo replied that they were electric trucks and charging stations for vehicles, and when the host asked who they belonged to, Tim Leader suggested that they belonged to DS Beer and Hain Yangjo. The presenter asked his assistant to advance the presentation to the next slide. Chai-un sat behind her team leader and watched closely. The next slide showed another row of small trucks. When the wedding was switched to the third, a photo of one of the trucks with black exhaust pipes appeared. Min-soo replied that the trucks belonged to Soya Liquor and were parked in the factory's parking lot in Busan. The host noted that this was the true face of the company, which was a leader in the alcoholic beverage market. I asked Min-soo whether they intended to continue inactive, to which he replied that they had planned to introduce an environmental development program, which prompted the question why this had not been done until now. One of the men present at the hearing did not allow Min-soo to answer and shouted that he had not initially planned to switch to ecological methods, which is why he was dragged into the hearing by the ears. The man was outraged that the company simply did not want to spend extra money on new equipment and therefore was harming the environment. Min-soo wasn't the least bit flustered by this statement. He knew he should have expected the committee member to yell uncontrollably at the witness. It was a scene of congressmen wanting to project a strong image to their constituents. They used their congressional powers to criticize a large immoral organization and stalled, not even giving it a chance to respond to the charges. For Min-soo, this was a very familiar and predictable scenario. After waiting for the man to finish shouting, the leader asked the host if he could answer the question. The man, who was screaming with his teeth clenched, suggested that the leader try to do this. Min-soo said that Soya Group had been planning to implement environmentally friendly logistics systems for a long time, but it took some time because they felt that the time was not right yet. The man asked whether the witness meant to say that the other two companies had created a stir out of nothing, and that the issue of deurbanization was not so pressing, and Min-soo fully agreed with this. The team leader responded that the time when the two companies purchased electric trucks and installed fast chargers was when all other establishments were seeing an increase in sales of electric vehicle chargers. He knew that if the congressman was trying to prevent the witness from speaking, then it was necessary to include someone with the same level of authority in the game, and noted that the reasons for the increase in sales were government subsidies and an attempt to quickly purchase cheap Chinese goods. The attacking man was very angry, and he blurted out that no one dared to involve government subsidies in this. Others present calmed the man down, asking him not to interrupt the witness, as he would not be able to answer if they continued shouting at him about everything. The man was indignant, declaring that he had every right to ask the witness questions, but other participants in the hearing began to argue with him, insisting on hearing the answer to the previous questions. During these disputes, the time for the witness to respond ran out, as stated by the chairman of the hearing. He handed the floor over to committee member Park Suk-joon, who thanked the chairman and stated that he represented the National Justice Party. Park Suk-joon turned to witness Lee and, noting that he seemed to have been given no time to answer the previous question regarding logistic systems, asked him to continue where he left off. The man who was trying his best to interrupt Lee Min-soo became even more indignant, insisting that the committee member ask his own question, but Lee Min-soo noted that he had the right to ask questions himself. Min-soo continued to say that due to the shortage of power modules on the market, which accounted for more than 50% of the cost of chargers, there was a huge demand for cheap Chinese components, and the same story was with electric trucks. The witness emphasized that, especially considering that the tender for such goods was held at the lowest price, this problem could not but worsen, and even Ms. Signet, a leading domestic company, was forced out by cheap Chinese goods and completely withdrew from state tenders due to pricing issues. Min-soo took a look at the statistics, which showed that the share of Chinese power modules he mentioned earlier increased from 33.5% to 74.2%, or more than doubled. Min-soo also noted that at the same time the presence of domestic products decreased from 52% to 25.1%, not to mention the rest of the transport equipment excluding power modules. Min-soo emphasized that the state wanted to create favorable conditions for the development of environmentally friendly businesses. The witness stated that he believed that the subsidies were national investments to create a foundation for the growth of domestic companies, but he questioned whether it was possible to purchase Chinese goods while receiving subsidies from Korean taxpayers' money. Min-soo also emphasized that there have been no precedents in the world for government subsidies to help another country's economy grow, which is why Soya Liquor tried to delay the implementation of green logistics systems. The room immediately erupted in commotion. People began to complain that they were using their own citizens' money to feed the Chinese economy. Many immediately began to think that the domestic market was being destroyed along with the ground for business growth. Committee member Park Suk-joon noted that he heard the witness's response and concluded that Soya Liquor had a compelling reason not to implement the new systems. Suk-joon asked, leaving aside the logistics topic of the hearing's main topic of decarbonization, to briefly describe the measures companies were preparing to take. The witness explained that various carbonization strategies were already being implemented. He noted that the waste heat disposal system had been improved, replaced with high-efficiency LED lighting, and environmentally friendly facilities had been expanded, and explained that his assistant had supporting materials. The committee member asked the girl to stand up. Chae-yoon immediately rose from her seat and was ready to answer. Journalists present at the hearing were shocked by the appearance of the chairman's daughter. When asked if she had the materials her colleague had mentioned, Chae-yoon explained that they had prepared evidence in both document and electronic form. Chae-yoon was asked to provide these documents to a committee member during a break, and Min-soo was approached again, noting that judging by their investigation, the volume of work actually performed by the company was similarly minimal. Park Suk-joon asked whether Lee Min-soo was really implementing all these projects, noting that they needed testimony and witnesses. Min-soo was warned that if any inconsistencies were discovered, legal proceedings would follow, so he had to choose his words carefully, and Min-soo only chuckled in response. He noted that he was afraid that it would not be possible to answer this question immediately. A committee member looked at him closely and asked why, to which Min-soo explained that their ESG department was only creating a proposal to the company, and the detailed implementation was carried out by the subsidiary in accordance with their circumstances. Min-soo was asked if he meant that Soya Liquor should answer this question themselves, and the team leader confirmed this, explaining that in the current situation they would provide a more detailed answer. The hearing chairperson said that in that case, for the next hearing, he would request the personal presence of a Soya Liquor employee who could testify. The chairman of the hearing emphasized that he had no more questions and thanked the witness for his answer. In this way, Min-soo achieved his goal, which was to destroy the scapegoat scheme and make Kang Jun-woo drown. The idea was quite simple. First, they'd create a foundation where ESG could successfully accomplish their goal, and then shift any remaining issues to soya liquor if any new issues arose. Min-soo thought that he was sure. He tried to avoid attending the hearing until the last minute, but in the end he got into a situation in which he had no choice but to appear. The committee members who had been terribly humiliated at the first hearing would certainly have sharpened their knives to cut up their victim at the next one. Min-soo was very curious about how Kang Jun-woo would respond to the accusations presented. In no time, Kang Jun-woo was already reading the invitation to the next hearing on his tablet. He became incredibly angry when he saw how events turned out and threw the tablet at the wall. Kang Jun-woo was now furious and cursed Lee Min-soo, who did not want to play his games. Assistant Park watched the entire hearing live. Naturally, he didn't want to miss anything important. The assistant looked quite upset that everything happened this way, but at the same time, the assistant was incredibly happy about what an amazing person their team leader was. Assistant Park couldn't watch the beginning of the broadcast and was busy with work, but he was glad everything had worked out. He'd been in the restroom the entire time and decided to return to the office, realizing the manager was being mean to him. He left the toilet thinking that he should return as quickly as possible. But as soon as he left the booth, he bumped into Manager Chan, who was doing exactly the same thing, namely watching the live broadcast of the hearing. Assistant Park wanted to smooth things over and, turning to the manager, noted that people apparently tended to get distracted in the restrooms. The manager didn't appreciate this joke and yelled at the assistant to stop talking nonsense and get back to work quickly. The manager stood in the restroom for a while, thinking about what he saw on live television. Horror came as evening approached and Min-soo and Chae-eun returned to the office. Assistant Park immediately called out to him, delighted to see the team leader back. Min-soo glanced at the assistant and asked how things were going in the department and if everything was all right. Assistant Park turned to Chae-eun and emphasized how great she had been. Chae-eun, approaching her desk, said that assistant should have seen it in person, as their team leader had performed spectacularly. Chae-eun approached the manager and asked if he had watched the broadcast. The manager, without even looking at her, replied that he had. Chae-eun immediately asked him if he liked them and whether he thought their leader was incredible. Manager Jung briefly replied that he enjoyed the audition, including Chae-eun's performance. At the same time, the manager felt depressed and something was bothering him, although he tried not to show it. Manager Chan looked at the team leader, who had already started working on his computer. The manager got up from the table and approached the leader, asking for a little of his attention. The manager started talking about the tasks he had assigned to the department and informed that he had managed to upload one from each. The manager also informed the land surveyor that he would submit the report on the remaining ones by the end of the working day on Monday, to which the leader nodded approvingly. But the manager didn't leave. With even greater caution, he called out to Tim again. Manager Chan bowed his head slightly and thanked team leader for his efforts. Assistant Park and Chae-eun looked at each other in surprise and then turned their gaze back to the manager, whom team leader also thanked and noted that he had also done a good job here. Chae-eun suddenly remembered something and a very wide smile appeared on her face. She turned to the leader and, reminding him that it was Friday, suggested that they all have dinner together, since it was customary to celebrate such joyful events in a friendly company. Min-soo looked at her with bewilderment and sharply replied that he did not want to participate in this. Chae-eun hoped that team leader would at least consider the offer for a second. The girl, reluctant to join, asked when they would have such a dinner. Min-soo replied some other time. The team leader looked at his watch and, after checking the time, noted that the entire team could already be free. Chae-eun thanked her colleagues for their work with a hint of disappointment in her voice. Assistant Park wished him a good weekend and he immediately headed for the exit. Assistant Park glanced at the time on his phone and mentally noted that it was indeed already 6:00 p.m. and it was time to leave. Assistant Park jumped up in his seat in surprise when the leader, who had not yet left, addressed him. Min-soo looked at his assistant and noted that his task today had indeed been well completed. Min-soo emphasized that the assistant had done a high-quality job. The assistant was stunned by such praise, but at the same time very pleased. The assistant thanked the team leader for such words. but the latter on the contrary emphasized that there was no need to thank him for this. Chae-eun looked at the worried assistant Park and smiled to herself, happy for his success. Chae-eun had no intention of leaving, and declaring that she would sort out the material from today's hearing told the boys that they could pack up and leave. Manager Young-i and assistant Park immediately got ready and left the department, hurrying to the elevator. Assistant Park felt very awkward after the praise and next to the silent manager. Assistant Park noted that he had never felt so awkward riding in the same elevator before, and he didn't quite understand the leader's final words. He was at a loss as to what his corporate life had become. Manager Chan turned to his assistant, but he didn't even glance at her. However, the manager managed a small smile. The manager looked at the assistant and simply offered him a drink instead of going home. The assistant did not expect such a proposal at all and was at a loss before answering. Assistant Pak naturally agreed to the proposal, wanting to unwind a bit and perhaps get closer to his colleague. They went to a street restaurant, and when they were seated, the manager asked if the assistant liked fish. Assistant Park replied that he wasn't particularly picky about food, so the manager ordered fried sori and a bottle of soju. When the drinks arrived, the manager immediately poured them into glasses and drank them. Assistant Pak followed suit and also drank the drink. Along with the drinks, they brought the dishes that the manager ordered. The manager remained silent the entire time, as usual, reticent. But it was clear he was thinking about many things. Putting the empty glass on the table, the manager said that he realized that he had made a big mistake. The assistant asked again what he was talking about, and the manager replied that he was sure that their team was a death pit. He shared that he felt like Kang Chae-eun would become a puppet and he would be kicked out of the company. He thought the assistant would be an outcast like himself once was, and that the leader in this scheme was simply a sly figurehead. These words gave the assistant pause, but he continued listening to the manager. Manager Chan, taking a quail egg from the plate, noted that he now understood perfectly well that everything was completely different from what he had imagined. The manager emphasized that his entire team were good people and began to list each one, but the assistant interrupted him, assuring him that he too was a very good person. The manager turned to the assistant with some alarm in his voice and then asked him to tell him what was wrong. The manager was peeling an egg and, looking only at his hands, asked his assistant to try to hold on. The manager emphasized that having good people around you was a much rarer luxury than the assistant could have imagined, to which the assistant noted that the manager was now very different from who he had been in the office. The manager asked the assistant to forget about all of this. I emphasized that his nasty character was to blame for everything and put the already peeled egg on the assistant's plate. The manager also said that if the assistant shirks, he will reprimand him again. The manager offered them another drink, and Pak's assistant began to tear up. He looked ready to burst into tears at any moment. The manager whined slightly and asked why the assistant was whining, to which the latter began to thank the manager for such words towards him. Meanwhile, work continued at the company office. Due to the circumstances, many remained at their desks late. The vice chairman sat in his office and watched the recording of the hearing over and over again, trying to catch every word said there. There was a strange grin on the vice chairman's face, and he smiled from time to time at certain statements heard at the hearing. Pausing the video, the chairman grabbed his work phone, feeling the need to call someone. The phone was immediately picked up, and the vice chairman stated that the ESG had become his personal responsibility. The people on the other end of the line were surprised and noted that if this was because of Kang Chae-eun, then the vice chairman had already said that he did not intend to interfere in matters of succession, but he assured that the succession had nothing to do with it. The chairman asked the man to imagine a situation where he found an apparently unremarkable necklace, but inside there was a diamond hidden. The vice chairman could not hold back the smile that kept spreading across his face. He thought about Lee Min-soo and believed that this person was identical to the incident with the diamond in the necklace. A young man stood on the pier and looked for a long time at the waves crashing against the coastal rocks. The young man heard the roar of a car engine. He hadn't expected anyone to arrive at this location, so he turned around in surprise to see who had arrived. The young man was even more surprised when he saw Lee Min-soo, who waved his hand at him with a wide smile. The young man's name was Min-gu. He approached the car, remarking that Min-soo had chosen the perfect day as the water was very good. Min-soo suggested that they hurry, noting that he would be right there as soon as he parked the car. The boys were soon dressed and racing in a motorboat across the water, moving away from the shore. Min-gu shouted that Saksho, where they were, always had beautiful views, and asked if Min-soo was ready to dive, and he answered that he was ready without a drop of doubt. Before jumping into the water, Min-gu asked Min-soo how he felt about catching some sea creatures at the same time, and Min-soo, putting on a mask, replied that it sounded very good. Min-soo said that he wanted to go first and immediately jumped into the water without waiting for an answer from Min-gu, who was even a little indignant that they didn't wait for him. Min-soo immediately began to descend to the bottom. He felt very confident in the water and knew what to do as he had been diving for a very long time. The neutral buoyancy zone was located between 10 and 15 meters deep. This was the place where gravity and buoyancy balanced each other, and Min-soo could hover freely at a stable depth. When Min-soo entered this zone, his memories, hidden in his deep subconscious, appeared before his eyes. Min-soo remembered himself many years ago when he worked in the office and was an ordinary employee and not a department leader. He remembered how one day a colleague came up to him and, putting his arm around his shoulder, noted that it was only thanks to him that the entire team had completed the task in an instant, although his joy was not overflowing. After graduating with a degree in IT, Min-soo immediately went to work for a venture capital company developing mobile applications that his brother founded. This period was a mixture of his happiest, bitterest, and most hateful memories. For 3 years he worked with his brother, often spending all night on development. The thought that one day all this work would pay off gave him and his brother the strength to move on. When they began to see the results, Min-soo was incredibly happy to watch his brother rejoice, and then it seemed that a green streak had arrived. But as Min-soo realized later, life often had other plans which were fundamentally different from his own. The death of his brother was a serious blow to Min-soo. He stared at his brother's photograph in mourning for a long time, unable to comprehend it. No matter how hard Min-soo tried to comprehend this, he couldn't. He wondered why his brother, who had seen nothing but hard work in life, had died so early. Min-soo's brother suddenly began to rapidly decline, and it was later discovered he had been diagnosed with cancer. Before his death, his brother left a will for his wife, nephew, and him, as if he understood his life was short. He sold the fledgling company to another corporation, leaving a significant inheritance to his family. Min-soo's brother's company was acquired by Soya Group. Min-soo gave several $100 million to his brother's widowed wife, and he himself got a job at Soya, but it soon became clear that the decision to sell the company was a mistake because the year of his brother's death, the pandemic began, followed by a surge in the app market. Brother Min-soo lost his parents early, worked from early childhood, and passed away without even having time to enjoy life, and until the very last moment he did everything for the benefit of his loved ones. Thoughts of his brother always caused a tearing pain in Min-soo's chest that he was unable to suppress. There were many times when Min-soo cried loudly and could not stop. Min-gu was already scared to death. He had already managed to climb onto the boat and had waited too long for Min-soo to rise from the depths. Min-soo climbed out of the water and sprawled on the boat, trying to catch his breath. Min-gu cautiously asked if he was okay, and Min-soo confirmed it and asked what was wrong. Min-gu looked at him and asked if he understood how long he had been underwater, and Min-soo calmly asked him to tell him about it. Min-gu noted that he had been underwater for 5 minutes and 17 seconds and was already very worried, thinking about diving after him. Min-soo wiped the water from his forehead and looked at the sky, noting that he was probably in very good shape that day. Min-soo asked how things were going with Min-gu and whether he had already managed to dive and return, and he, smiling broadly, showed that he had returned with more prey. Min-gu happily noted that they would probably be able to try Min-soo's signature sea cucumber soup today, and then he smiled approvingly at him in response. The guys went to the shore and soon sat down to dinner and decided to have a few drinks. Min-gu was delighted with the set table and looked at each dish with curiosity. Min-soo laughed next to Min-gu, something he rarely did. In this company he could truly relax. Soon it was time to say goodbye. Min-nu, having gathered all his gear, headed home and waved goodbye to his friend. The full moon had already risen high in the starry sky to illuminate the entire city. Min-soo walked along the beach alone, enjoying the sea air and the atmosphere in general. While walking along the embankment, Min-soo heard someone's voice and then a request to stop, but they were definitely not intended for him. First, Min-soo saw a man with his arm around a woman. They were laughing, flirting, and hugging. The man smiled and invited the girl to return to the yacht as it was getting cooler outside. By this time, Min-soo was already close and recognized the man. Approaching even closer, Min-soo called out to an old acquaintance named Gu-hyun. The man was not very happy to meet Min-soo, and the first question that arose in his mind was why this guy was also in this place. Min-soo replied that he was just taking a stroll, and seeing him decided to approach him. Gu-hyun was surprised that he'd been strolling there, but Min-soo explained that he often came to Sakcho. Making it known that he had heard Gu Hyun's last conversation with the girl, Min-soo decided to inquire about the yacht. Gu Hong said that the yacht belonged to his friend, and at that moment a young man looked out from the yacht and called the captain. He was clearly addressing Gu Hong, asking whether it was worth leaving the yacht at the pier, and I'm not happy that everything happened at that very moment, asking the young man to leave the yacht parked at the pier. Min-soo noted that in that case the yacht apparently belonged to Gu Hong, and then lighting a cigarette he agreed, explaining that he had managed to buy it. Min-soo pointed out that his friend must have earned a good living since he could buy a yacht, to which Gu Hyun replied that he earned enough to feed himself. Gu Hyun hugged the girl and began to move away, finally noting that he was glad to see her anyway, promising that he and Min-soo would have dinner together someday. Min-soo heard the girl ask Gu Hyun who they met, and then he freely told her that this man was the brother of the one he worked with in the past. In fact, Lee Min-soo didn't care much about the person from his past life. To Min-soo, Kim Gu Hyun was a very insignificant character, no more significant than a stone lying on the side of the road. Min-soo spent his weekend in Sakcho and was forced to return to the office and start work by Monday. From early morning, the department was already in full swing, just like usual. Everyone was busy with their assigned tasks. Min-soo's phone rang again. The team leader picked it up and after introducing himself heard it was department head Jung-yu from Biscuit House. Jung-yu explained that they were a comprehensive entertainment company and their people were involved in online content production and management, to which Min-soo suggested that it seemed like he had dialed the wrong number as he had ended up in the ESG department of Soya Group. Jung-yu asked the team leader not to hang up and asked if there was a girl named Kang Chae-eun working in his department and asked to call her to the phone. Without further ado, the team leader called out to Chae-eun, who had never expected anyone to contact her on that day. When the leader explained to the girl who wanted to contact her, her face contorted. One might assume the girl knew who he was talking about. The team leader explained that their company had seen the recording of the hearing and decided to contact her, but the woman immediately indicated that she had no intention of working with them and asked them to refuse. Min-soo emphasized that she should do it herself since she was the one who had called. Chae-eun picked up the phone and, apologizing for her rudeness, emphasized that she shouldn't have called her department so directly, to which she heard that they could discuss the details after work. The girl noted that this was not what she meant and informed that she was simply hanging up, but they shouted at her that they could offer 200 million as a bonus for signing the contract. Chae-eun ignored this information and hung up anyway. She was very angry about what she heard and about the amount they offered her. The department immediately asked how she managed to break into the video hosting charts, but the girl knew nothing about it, although everyone in the comments was talking only about her. Min-soo's phone rang again and he rolled his eyes as he picked it up. He was very glad that his phone had been ringing off the hook all day. Tim Linder looked at Chae-eun and said that they asked for her again on the phone, but seeing the girl's condition, he immediately refused. Min-soo hung up the phone, but it seemed as if he kept his eyes on the phone to check his instincts. Tim, the leader's instinct, did not fail him, and another bell rang. Min-soo was very unhappy with what was happening and didn't even know how to comment on it. I think they were calling again about his assistant. Min-soo picked up the phone but heard that General Manager Kang Jun-woo was calling him. The General Manager immediately asked if Min-soo could come into his office to discuss something. Min-soo acted cautiously, although he had a rough idea of what the conversation with the General Manager would be about. The team leader agreed without any unnecessary questions or indignation and promised that he would come by soon. Chae-eun was worried that they were calling again about her, so she asked the team leader to let her answer all the calls, but he immediately noted that the general manager had called him and informed him that he should go to his office. Chae-eun was surprised and thought that the general manager must have called her teaming leader because of the hearing. At first, Chae-eun was very happy that everything turned out this way, but now she realized that the leader's speech was provocative. There was no doubt that the team leader was incredibly talented, but it was precisely because of this talent that he sometimes acted too carelessly. Every time team leader demonstrated his skills, there was a high risk of making new enemies. This was now obvious to Chae-eun. Chae-eun considered the team leader to be a very reliable ally, but at the same time it was hard to remain calm around him because the team leader was a walking nuclear warhead. Chae-eun believed that, with such abilities, those people should be more careful. And no matter how much she thought about it, it remained obvious that his chemistry with the general manager was the worst in the entire company. Min-soo immediately headed to the CEO's office. As soon as he reached the door, the leader knocked on it. The general manager, not in the best mood, hissed through his teeth that Min-soo could come in. As soon as the doors opened and the team leader appeared on the threshold, the general manager noted that he did not need to come in, and that it would be better for him to remain in place. The general manager, without even looking up at the leader who entered, said that he was very disappointed. Min-soo closed the door behind him and looked at the general manager and asked if he had made a mistake. The general manager was surprised that the team leader could allow himself to call this a mistake. The general manager seethed with rage and emphasized that the leader had deliberately done everything to frame him. He glanced at Min-soo and asked why he thought no one would suspect anything. The general manager rose from his chair and came close to Lee Min-soo, no longer addressing him by name. The general manager looked him straight in the eye and asked if he really expected to sit quietly at the company after all this. The manager emphasized that he wasn't some cheap cur and shouldn't have been treated like that. Min-soo, maintaining his usual calm, asked whether the general manager meant to say that he would seek his dismissal. The general manager refused to make such a statement, and Min-soo emphasized that if that was what he meant, he could proceed calmly. Min-soo simply asked to tell him to start sending his resume to other companies because he didn't want to waste any more time staying in his old position. Min-soo opened the door slightly, noting that if that was the entire conversation, he wanted to leave. The general manager shouted that he had not let anyone go. Min-soo turned to him and with a slight grin noted that he was apparently climbing up other people's heads. He glanced at the general manager and noted that you could never be sure you were safe because one day one of the stragglers could grab your leg and pull you down. Min-soo, taking steps towards the exit, emphasized that the general manager should be grateful that he stopped there because things could have turned out much worse for him. At this point, Min-soo declared that the conversation between them was over and left the office, leaving the general manager to experience his anger alone. After talking with the general manager, this leader immediately returned to his department. Chae-eun saw that the team leader had returned and asked how the conversation with Kang Jun-woo had gone. But he only pretended that he hadn't heard anything. Chae-eun clarified that she meant what the general manager told him, and that the leader replied that he had not heard anything special. Manager Chan decided not to stand aside and speak out, so she turned to the team leader. The manager stood up from his seat and noted that for the entire department it would be better if the team leader informed them, otherwise they would not be able to work peacefully. The manager also emphasized that he himself could not work peacefully, and then asked the team leader again why the general manager had called him. Min-soo, staring at the computer monitor, told the manager that Kang Jun-woo was simply barking at him and foaming at the mouth, which was a great surprise for the manager. But Min-soo calmly added that he personally had to ask the general manager to stop all this, and Young Kyung-jun was taken aback by this answer. Min-soo emphasized that the general manager was likely ashamed of himself for such ridiculous behavior. Assistant Park joined Manager Young in shock at the team leader's response. Chae-eun simply grabbed her head when she heard what her team leader was saying, realizing that it was a 5, and did the same. The girl held out hope until the very end, but the leader actually confronted Kang Jun-woo. She was afraid the leader might be fired after that. Chae-eun couldn't afford to lose this man. The next moment, the team leader's phone rang again, and he immediately picked it up. The leader called the vice chairman and asked him to come into his office, to which the leader immediately agreed, and I promised that he would be there soon. Min-soo, getting up from the table and putting on his jacket, informed everyone that the vice chairman had called him and that he would go to his office. Min-soo promised he'd be back soon and asked the others to continue their work. The team agreed but was perplexed. When Min-soo left, the office manager Jong remarked that in 11 years of working in this company, this was the first time he had seen such a person, because first he was called by the general manager from the subsidiary company, and now he himself is the vice chairman. Chae-eun listened. She was only thinking about how to prevent those people from making even more enemies, because in his case it was very dangerous. The girl hoped that since this time the vice chairman had called him, perhaps everything would go well. Min-soo entered the vice chairman's office and, sitting down on the sofa, noticed he'd been called. The vice chairman glanced at the leader, grinned, and tossed it into the bag. The vice chairman noted that he was very pleased with the hearing and noted that the team leader had nerves of steel and was also not lacking in skills. The vice chairman looked at this leader and asked why he worked specifically for ESG. Min-soo explained that he had the opportunity to become that leader, but the vice chairman doubted that this was really the main reason. The team leader assured him that this was indeed the case, but the vice chairman laughed at the girls again, noting that the young man was lying very brazenly. The vice chairman noted that he knew perfectly well that he and his brother were working on a mobile application. It is likely that the team leader did not leave development for the sake of promotion, and if they had done this he would have stayed at his old job. The vice chairman smiled broadly and stated without hesitation that promotion was not a priority for the team leader. The vice chairman understood that the team leader wanted to be heavily dependent on other employees to only complete the assigned work every day, collect her salary on time, and continue as long as possible, and if things went badly, always have the option to calmly leave. Min-soo was very shocked that the vice chairman had completely figured him out. The vice chairman insisted that this could not continue for long and announced that he intended to make ESG a leading department, taking it under his direct responsibility. Min-soo didn't answer him, and the vice chairman asked him to say at least something and note whether he would like to leave the department. Min-soo looked coldly at the vice chairman and explained that he did not have a strong attachment to his job position. The vice chairman emphasized that he knew about this answer well in advance and believed that this was precisely why he was not afraid to go against the general manager, because he had nothing to fear. The vice chairman also suggested that it could simply be a show of confidence, and that Tim, the leader, knew that he could find a better position in another company at any moment. The vice chairman's voice became harsher, and he shouted that this was an illusory opportunity, and that a worthy campaign would not make any concessions to him, although of course in theory he could be very lucky, but the chances of this were incredibly small. The vice chairman grunted his hand on the table, noting that Tim, the leader, couldn't constantly change companies like gloves with a resume full of dismissals for which no one would take him seriously. The vice chairman also noted that the leader's self-confidence was understandable, but he did not know that life could slide into an abyss in an instant, and emphasized that he himself had not always held his position. He explained that he was just another ordinary employee who had to endure hardships to reach the top, and Min-soo was far from the first person like him he'd met. The chairman asked the team leader to think carefully, as being able to carefully consider one's next steps was an extremely important life skill. Having finished this monologue, the vice chairman suddenly remembered that he had completely forgotten to say the most important thing, having become carried away by his story. Min-soo doesn't want to listen to this once again, and immediately stated that he will simply leave the company. The vice chairman never expected to hear such an answer. I hope that he will be able to convince Min-soo and suppress him. The vice chairman looked at the team leader and asked him to repeat what he had said, and Min-soo calmly repeated that he was going to resign. Min-soo immediately got up from the sofa and wished the vice chairman all the best as he headed towards the exit of his office. The vice chairman was very confused, not expecting such a turn of events, and was unable to stop Min-soo in any way. All of the vice chairman's plans collapsed the moment the team leader headed for the exit of his office without even turning around. The rope that the vice chairman tried to tie this young man to himself and force him to obey simply snapped. Unable to bear it, the vice chairman shouted, forcing Min-soo to stop and listen to him until the end. The vice chairman was incredibly angry and was ready to tear Lee Min-soo apart for behaving like that. A few minutes ago, before talking with the team leader, the vice chairman called on the phone and asked if the girl had collected information regarding Lee Min-soo and asked her to send him files about it. Min-soo's performance at the hearing went flawlessly, and the vice chairman initially indicated that he had decided to calmly complete his task, but he had not expected such an ending. Even someone of Kang Jun-woo's stature would be unlikely to make such a move. But in the case of Lee Min-soo, it seemed as if he was not at all concerned about the consequences of such impudence. To the vice chairman, this guy was like a sword blade that simply cut through whatever stood in his way. Throughout this process, the vice chairman came to realize the strengths of the ESG team. He hadn't previously given much thought to this department and their crazy leader, but this time something caught his attention. The ESG department, due to its specialization, had access to investigations. Representative organizations with investigative functions in the government were the National Intelligence Service, the Prosecutor's Office, and the Tax Service. All of this had one thing in common, namely the ability to stick one's nose everywhere, possessing enormous power both in the shadows and in the light. The vice chairman believed that the ESG department had similar characteristics, and if this isolation was used wisely, the department could intervene and influence almost all other departments. The Innovation Strategy Department also had similar characteristics, but on a global level it was very different from ESG. While the Innovation Department was strictly committed to sustainable corporate growth, ESG was the team on the opposite side. It could be assumed that there was a subsidiary company that needed to reduce purchase prices by 5% every year in order to survive in the market. With such aggressive price competition, the market quickly became a zero-sum game that continued until one of the competitors was eliminated. This is where the ESG department came into play. The department insisted that if purchase prices were constantly reduced, then this was an attempt to harm the financial position of the partner company, and it was necessary to understand that the well-being of the partner company's employees was another criterion. The department talked about entering the used car market, wondering what to do about the trade in old used trucks that were emitting exhaust fumes. This was the very essence of the ESG department's existence. Kept all the others in line. In other words, they could interfere in any process since they worked with the sphere of the nature of society, including management. This was because no subsidiary company was able to hide from their investigation. The department had a sharp blade and a measuring stick that could reach anyone, and such was the fate of the ESG department and Lee Min-soo in particular. The vice chairman thought it would be the perfect weapon against the chairman's younger brother, who intended to expand his influence and gradually bring the corporation under his control. The vice chairman also understood that this was a risky method and that the department's team leader's blade, if used incorrectly, could turn into poison for the wielder. The vice chairman understood that this guy had enough courage to leave strictly on schedule on the eve of the hearing. Moreover, in the process, they also managed to strike a blow against a member of the ruling family. It was precisely because of this weapon, which could not be controlled, that it would be best to break it. The vice chairman also knew full well that it was too early to take such action, and that it was first necessary to find out whether this guy was worth the risks. The vice chairman looked into his background and learned that he was among the top graduates of the university in the big data analytics department, and since he worked as an ESG leader, it seemed that he had a background in sociology. Moreover, the vice chairman noted that the team leader was working on a delivery app for us which had recently shown explosive growth in shares, making things even more interesting. Min-soo's reputation among the employees was also quite good, as he always did his job well, although he could be a little rude. The vice chairman considered the leader to be a rather remarkable young man and quite unique. However, the vice chairman realized what kind of person he was, and was confident that someone would find an approach to him. After all, he had been working with people in this area for many years. The vice chairman thought he would be able to show how a real predator operates until Min-soo came into his office. Min-soo, hearing the vice chairman's cry, calmly returned and sat down in his place, asking if he wanted to say anything else. The vice chairman thought he'd studied his behavior history and reputation, and was confident he could control him, but he never expected such a dismissive attitude. He asked if the leader was actually planning to leave. Hearing that Min-soo confirmed his words about dismissal, the vice chairman grabbed his head, lamenting what a stubborn scoundrel the young man was. The vice chairman wanted to shower him with curses and throw him out of his office, but his disinterest intrigued him even more. In the current situation, it was very difficult to be sure who was on whose side, and that was why Min-soo's value was off the charts. No matter what the chairman's brother's people tried to intimidate or entice Min-soo with, nothing had or would have any effect on him. The vice chairman noted that since he had to hold the line until the chairman returned to his post, Lee Min-soo could be of great benefit to him. This man, in the opinion of the vice chairman, possessed outstanding skills but was not involved in corporate games and was unlikely to become interested in them in the future. This meant that the leader would not be afraid to strike at the supporters of the brother chairman. The vice chairman cursed and then asked what Min-soo really wanted. The team leader explained that he did not quite understand what the singer meant. The chairman openly stated that he was proposing a deal. The vice chairman offered the leader a meeting with him, and he in turn would perform any service requested of him. He emphasized that if the young man wanted a promotion, he would get it and could even become president of a subsidiary. The singer chairman really hoped that Min-soo would be interested in his proposal, but then he remained silent for a while. After a long pause, Min-soo looked at the vice chairman and asked if he would mind getting an answer a little later. Min-soo explained his answer by saying he had absolutely no need for anything at the moment. The vice chairman asked whether he had generally agreed to the deal, and he confirmed this. The vice chairman was even surprised because he didn't think that Tim, the leader, would go along with this so easily, and he asked if he hadn't acted until now out of a dislike for working with other people. Min-soo replied that it didn't matter and he still carried out tasks within the work regulations. The vice chairman caught the words about the task within the framework of the regulations, and this prompted him to think of something. The vice chairman thought he understood, and Min-soo didn't care about the tasks themselves as long as he could leave work on time, and then everything would be fine. He felt he should have told him from the start that Min-soo wouldn't have to work late. Min-soo, watching the vice chairman become lost in thought, asked if he could go. The vice chairman asked the leader to wait another minute as he wanted to tell him about the work he was about to assign to him. Min-soo knew everything in advance, noting that the conversation could probably go to Kang Young-woo, and the vice chairman probably wanted something like this to happen whenever it was needed. The pizza chairman was taken aback by this answer and could not understand how the leader had been able to unravel the internal intrigues of the corporation even before the open offer. This meant that Lee Min-soo was aware of the situation that Kang Chae-eun and the chairman's brother were in. It also turned out that Tim, the leader, agreed to the deal even though he understood what changes it would lead to. The chairman had no idea what was going on in this guy's head, but he agreed that he was right and had grasped the essence. The pizza chairman also asked Min-soo not to expect that everything would be so simple, noting that as soon as he became his direct subordinate, the other side would start paying a lot of attention to him. The vice chairman asked Min-soo not to make a mistake and emphasized that he must demonstrate his skills to the best of his ability, since only a well-sharpened sword was fit for use and could not fail at the right moment. The vice chairman looked at the team leader again and asked if he understood what was being discussed, and he confirmed it. The vice chairman also clarified whether he understood that the first task was of great importance for his department, and Min-soo also understood this perfectly well. Finally, the vice chairman asked whether Min-soo was confident that he would cope well with the first task assigned to him. Min-soo was slightly embarrassed by this question and looked to the side before answering. Looking back at the vice chairman, the team leader declared that there was no task he couldn't handle. The vice chairman smiled broadly and allowed Min-soo to go about his business. Min-soo didn't hesitate even for a second and immediately headed for the exit. Min-soo was more than pleased with the conversation that had taken place, since this was part of his plans. While the leader was absent from the office, the entire team experienced his absence in their own way, and no one shared their thoughts. Chae-eun was the one who was most worried, as the situation had the greatest impact on her. The manager heard the girl's constant heavy sighs and advised her to stop frowning and drink a cup of coffee. The girl apologized for distracting the others from their work and shared that she was a little worried that the leader might say all sorts of things to the vice chairman. The manager simply listened as the assistant said that even for their topic leader this was too much, and Chae-eun agreed with him and noted that no matter what kind of person he was, it was still the vice chairman himself in front of him. Manager Chan was also worried about what other crazy things their leader might do, but he now believed that the department was not a death pit as he had previously assumed. He thought that since it really made sense for them to give it their all, it was his personal duty to help these leaders by becoming a strong support for their newcomers, since he was the only one here with 11 years of experience behind him. The manager asked his colleagues to stop thinking about it, to stop worrying about trifles, and hinted that they should just concentrate on work, because sometimes in order to put some people in their place you had to show madness. The manager emphasized that he agreed that sometimes their leader could go too far, but in the face of absolute power everyone became equal. In that case, even the team leader would have to wag his tail like an obedient dog when dealing with the vice chairman. He looked at his colleagues and asked them to agree with him, but they only looked at him in bewilderment. The manager didn't understand what he said wrong, not noticing that Min-soo was already standing behind him and heard everything that was said. The manager realized that he had said too much at the wrong time and hoped that the looks from his colleagues were for another reason. Upon seeing the team leader, the manager immediately asked him not to misunderstand him, but he only informed him that he had spoken with the vice chairman and some changes were planned in their department. Min-soo, in response to questions about this, explained that they will have a proactive working structure and will now have the authority to make the final decision. The manager asked what to do with requests from subsidiaries, and the leader asked not to accept them anymore. Min-soo explained that chaos would be avoided because they would request employees for the department from each subsidiary structure, and also explained that the detailed scope of work rules had not yet been determined and it was worth simply keeping this in mind. Min-soo, while telling about all this, still looked completely collected and calm, as if nothing had happened. He coldly and finally confirmed that from now on their department would work under the direct supervision of the vice chairman, which shocked everyone. The leader also warned that this could likely entail some scrutiny. Manager Chan paused when the leader said that the first task the department would take on was of the highest importance. Chae-eun listened to the leader's words about how they were obliged to do their job well, so that no one would even think of questioning the decision made by the vice chairman. Assistant Pak, while his other colleagues were thinking about the future, he became very nervous because he understood what responsibility fell on him as well. Min-soo looked around at all his colleagues, expecting any questions that were sure to arise. Chae-eun extended her hand and apologized, asking what kind of project they would start working on then. Min-soo hesitated a little and, looking away, explained that he would start thinking about it now. The whole team thought that the task had already been clearly defined and did not expect that everything would happen exactly this way. way. Min-soo advised the team to think about the same thing while there was time. The leader himself, as if nothing had happened, sat down to work, began to study some papers and type on the computer. Manager Chan realized that the time had come to act immediately, and that it was worth investing even more from this moment on. He turned to all his colleagues and asked them to pull themselves together. He called his assistant for a smoke break and Chaeun for a cup of coffee. He noted that they were in for some extremely intense work which required preparation. The team agreed and began to gather more vigorously for a short break. Min-soo simply ignored all the talk about someone going somewhere and about possible overtime. I think it didn't concern him. The entire team except for the team leader left the office and went on a short break as agreed. The manager and his assistant went out onto the terrace to smoke and get some air. Assistant Park looked very depressed. He was on the verge of tears again. The manager, noting the assistant's condition, asked him to take it into his own hands. The assistant shared that it was too unexpected for him, but the manager asked what was so special about it. The manager emphasized that this did not change anything since they were already busy with work. The manager turned to the assistant and asked if he remembered what they had discussed earlier. He reminded that it was enough to simply stay afloat no matter what was happening around. The assistant, slightly clenching his fists and feeling a sense of strength, assured the manager that he remembered his words. The manager praised him and noted that they would hold on to this opportunity with a death grip and put his arm around the assistant's shoulder. Tim, the leader, remained in the office and did some work and soon heard the phone ring again. Despite his great reserve and coldness, Min-soo was also nervous and the countless phone calls irritated him. "Let's go to the phone." He heard that the director of the Innovative Articles department named Cho Sung-bum was calling him and asking the team leader to come into his office. Min-soo had no choice but to get up from his desk again and head to the Innovation Strategy department. Cho Sung-bum heard a knock on the door of his office, immediately realized who had come and asked Min-soo to come in. Sun-bum, seeing the team leader, noted that he was glad to meet him in person and asked him to sit down. Sun-bum noted that recently everyone in the company was talking about the ESG department team leader, and wherever he went he heard that name. Min-soo sat down on the sofa and asked why he had been invited, and Sun-bum explained that the vice chairman had asked him to voice the general principles regarding changes in the department, and he thought that he should have spoken with that leader before holding the executive broadcast. Sun-bum asked whether the leader had read the Florentine Leader's Treatise, which described the methodology for seizing power, the methods of governance, and the skills necessary for an ideal ruler. Sun-bum, hearing that Tim, the leader, had read this work, noted that it said that if necessary it was possible, and even necessary, to crush the nobles, but one should never turn away from the citizens. According to this work, a new elite could be found at any moment, but the common people were the foundation of any state. Sun-bum emphasizes that this rule perfectly described the team leader's situation, and perhaps at that hearing he wanted to teach Mr. Kang Jun-woo a lesson. The result would have been that the entire corporation would have suffered a decline in reputation. Sun-bum explained that he meant by this that it was impossible to sow hostility among the employees. He also emphasized that now that Mr. Park Ki-ju has taken charge of the ESG department, all the hostility accumulated towards the department will gradually be directed at the co-chairman. Sun-bum immediately remembered that the general manager also had a grudge against the leader, and if this situation was not handled correctly, it could have resulted in a major scandal. Sun-bum also noted his half-brothers who were going to hand over soya foods to him, and considering the insult the leader had inflicted on him, they could not simply forget this matter. Min-soo was silent, just listening to Sun-bum. Well, he himself understood perfectly well how this could end. Sun-bum said everything he wanted and asked if the team leader himself wanted to speak, but then he declared that he had nothing to say. Sun-bum noted that he believed that the vice chairman had a reason for putting the team leader in this position, but his approach did not yet inspire much confidence. Sun-bum warned him that he wouldn't let the leader out of his sight and that he should be careful. Min-soo asked if the conversation was over as he had to get back to work. Sun-bum grinned, noting that Mr. Lee was quite straightforward even in situations like these. Well, we decided not to detain the team leader. He allowed him to leave, and Min-soo, before leaving the office, said that regardless of the opinion about him, he would keep his promise given to the vice chairman, so there was no need to worry about it. He looked at some BOM and asked if that answer was enough for him. Some BOM did not answer him, and then the leader, wishing him all the best, left his office. Some BOM was very impressed by this acquaintance with the one everyone was talking about. He had heard all sorts of things from the team leader, but in reality his behavior exceeded all expectations. Some BOM took a cigarette out of the pack and lit it and decided to let go of the situation and give Min-soo the opportunity to just go and try to do what he intended. Some BOM didn't care what the vice chairman had planned because he himself wanted to achieve the goal of kicking Lee Min-soo out of the company. Min-soo returned to his department, but now his calm had evaporated a little. The whole team was already at their workstations and unanimously asked where Min-soo had gone. The leader explained that he had been called by the director of innovation strategies and immediately noted that this was not so important at the moment. Returning to his workplace, the leader addressed everyone and asked them to listen to him very carefully. He stated that he had already decided what the first project of the updated ESG department would be. Min-soo called the entire team to his work computer and they immediately surrounded him. Min-soo clearly showed what exactly their first project would be. The team immediately realized that their project would be related to soya liquor. Min-soo confirmed their suspicions, explaining that it was the most accessible option, to which Manager Jung suggested that General Manager Kang Jun-woo was probably already harboring a grudge. Min-soo responded that sooner or later the general manager would have to accept their proposal, to which Chae-eun asked if the general manager would really calm down so easily, since this was not a joke at all. Min-soo was not worried about this, being confident that the subsidiary company would approve this project. And when he was asked why he was so confident, he asked to remember the square ice trays in old refrigerators. He explained that in order to get just one cube which was tightly stuck to the tray, it was necessary to twist and shake the entire container. After such manipulations, sooner or later one of the cubes would fall out. After these words, the whole team looked at each other, trying to grasp the essence of what was said. Min-soo didn't force his team to try to figure it all out themselves and explained that in their case the cube was General Manager Kang Jun-woo. Min-soo called him the weakest link in the entire company, who tried his best to stay in his place. But the point was that the general manager right at that very moment was desperately hanging over the abyss. Chae-eun finally understood why the leader acted so calmly and didn't seem to worry about anything. Min-soo was able to carefully analyze the situation and predict how everything would turn out. General Manager Kang Jun-woo, on the other hand, no longer felt confident and was incredibly angry. The general manager sat in his office among a pile of papers but could not sort out all these problems. He chewed gum after gum, and even that didn't help him calm down even a little. Kang Jun-woo cursed Lee Min-soo in every possible way. I doubt he gave him an equivalent response. After that hearing, the media attacks on the company which wanted to frame soya liquor abruptly ceased, which was not surprising since they found themselves in a difficult situation due to the purchase of Chinese goods but citizens' tax money. Overall, this was good news, but Min-soo had set up the general manager and at the same time painted her own team in a good light, and because of this they had to report to the hearing and prove that they were indeed engaged in decarbonization issues. Due to Lee Min-soo's fault, purchasing cheap Chinese components was now impossible. And in addition to installing expensive domestic chargers, they would also have to purchase local electric trucks, which cost twice as much. As an alternative, general managers considered domestically produced hydrogen trucks, but they were extremely inefficient, and not only were fuel expensive, but logistics also suffered due to the small number of filling stations in rural areas. What irritated the manager most was that he had overpaid huge amounts of money compared to his competitors, and they were also receiving lower quality goods, and because of what the team leader had said at the hearing, they would in any case have turned out to be idiots who were desperately trying to justify themselves. The general manager tried to come up with an extraordinary idea that would help turn the situation around. He tried to find a non-trivial solution that would suit everyone and find that hidden card that other companies did not have. The general manager's thoughts were interrupted by a phone call. The manager picked up the phone, and it turned out it was ESG team leader Lee Min-soo calling him. The general manager never expected to receive a phone call from this particular person. The general manager clenched his fist tightly, immediately felt incredible anger, and asked what Tim the leader wanted. Min-soo proposed cooperation in solving a logistics issue that the general manager was facing, but he reacted too harshly and began shouting various curses. The entire team of the team leader heard this and thus received confirmation of the words of their team leader. Chae-eun was still really worried that this might lead to problems, and manager Jong noted that the general manager was apparently not in the mood. Min-soo noted that the general manager had not yet realized the situation he was in, and that assistant Park asked if the team leader really thought this was possible. Min-soo explained that as soon as Kang Jun-woo realized that he had no other options, he would have to contact them, and until then they would go about their business. Min-soo asked the general manager to review the files he'd sent him. The general manager, without listening to the rest, simply smashed his phone in anger. The general manager was seething with rage. I believe that even in his bullying, Lee Min-soo should have known his limits. The general manager believed that as soon as the problem was resolved, he would personally deal with this team leader. The general manager just wanted to grab the team leader's throat with his teeth and tear him apart. Kang Jun-woo spat out his gum and felt like he had no idea how to properly resolve the situation. Kang Jun-woo looked around and saw all the mess he had made in his own office. Immediately after the hearing, he smashed his tablet and now his work phone. He noted that this was completely unlike him. He understood that when dealing with this leader, he could not always control himself, although he always acted carefully. There was a knock on the general manager's door, but he asked to come later, noting that he was very busy. And behind the door he heard curses and accusations that he had gotten himself into a very bad situation. The door opened and a man walked into the office without waiting for permission. It was Kang Jun-woo's brother, Kang Chun-hyuk, the third son of Vice President Kang Tae-chung and the executive director of sales and planning, was very surprised that his brother was outplayed by an ordinary employee. Kang Chun-hyuk chuckled that his brother allowed himself to be defeated by some pathetic team leader. Kang Jun-woo was always afraid of his brothers. At 18, he separated from his mother and joined the main family, and he was constantly haunted by guilt, fear of his new surroundings, and a vague sense of anticipation. He was told that he had 3 older brothers, but he had no idea what kind of people they were. For a very long time, he was not even able to properly talk to these people. The brothers treated Kang Jun-woo extremely coldly from the very beginning. These people seemed unattainable to him, too complex, and the fact that he was an illegitimate son finally made him cringe at the sight of his brothers. Seeing one of these brothers in his office, Kang Jun-woo frantically reached for another piece of gum, trying to find at least a little piece. He literally trembled with fear. He no longer had any confidence in himself or what he was doing in this place. Kang Chun-hyuk noted that he thought his brother was at least fit for the role of a rat that stole food from the barn. But it seems he overestimated him. Kang Jong-woo shouted that he would deal with that scumbag himself as soon as he settled the main problem. Kang Chun-hyuk just laughed at him, noting that it sounded very stupid coming from the mouth of someone who allowed himself to be kicked like a dog. The brother stretched out on the sofa and noted that Kang Jong-woo wouldn't be able to do anything to the team leader. He noted that his department had recently been transferred under the direct responsibility of the vice chairman, something Kang Jun-woo did not yet know. Kang Chun-hyuk laughed even more at the fact that his younger brother hadn't even heard such important news, and once again emphasized how pathetic he was. He called him a worthless idiot and asked why he thought the vice chairman had decided to take ESG under his wing. The reason for this event was directly due to the general manager, who allowed the ESG department to prove itself, and the innovation department was always a problem. And due to his fault, another headache appeared. Kang Jun-hyuk came a little closer and stated that Kang Jun-woo should have known his place. Kang Chun-hyuk stated outright that Jun-woo was not capable of much, and that was why he was up to his ears in a cesspool. To this, the general manager merely inquired where something was and met her with a knowing look. The general manager with clenched teeth asked where his place was, noting that no one had dared to install it, especially his brother. Kang Chun-hyuk laughed loudly, noting that Jong-woo's place was exactly where he was. After these words, Kang Chun-hyuk headed for the exit, and only at the end said that Jong-woo had managed to disappoint his father. Kang Chun-hyuk also added that he didn't come for all this, but just wanted to tell Jun-woo not to try to interfere with the work of the ESG department. The general manager was simply asked to stay out of the way and not interfere in anything else. As soon as his brother left, Kang Jun-woo fell to his knees in despair, realizing what kind of situation he found himself in.